You think you know yourself. You walk through the world with a name, a history, and a narrative you've built, a storyline you've rehearsed so many times that it feels like truth. You say, "I'm just not good with people," or "I've always been the anxious type," or "I know what I want in life." You think your preferences, your reactions, your beliefs, they're all evidence of who you really are. But what if I told you that most of what you believe about yourself was never truly yours to begin with? From the moment you were born, you were absorbing. Before you even had words, you were picking up on emotional tones, facial expressions, the subtle energy of approval or disappointment. You learned what made people smile. You learned what made them withdraw. And slowly, quietly, without permission, a version of you began to take shape. Not the true you, but the acceptable you, the pleasing you, the manageable you. That version became your mask. And over time, the mask grew so close to your skin you stopped realizing it was something you put on. But that's not even the most dangerous part. The truly haunting illusion is this. You don't just wear the mask, you defend it. You build a life around it, you filter every experience through it. You say, "This is who I am," and you're willing to suffer, shrink, and sabotage just to keep that story alive. Why? Because you've mistaken familiarity for truth. Because you think pain that feels like home must be part of your identity. Because breaking the illusion means you'd have to face a terrifying possibility, that you don't actually know yourself at all. That feels like death. The ego, that voice in your head that narrates everything, it feeds on certainty. It doesn't care if the story it's telling is false, it only cares that it feels familiar. And so when you question your identity, when you pause long enough to ask, "What if I'm wrong about who I am?" your mind panics. It rushes to distract you. It brings up old fears, old judgments, old pain, anything to keep you from peeling back the layers. Because beneath those layers is silence, emptiness, the unknown. And the ego would rather you stay in a painful illusion than face the stillness of not knowing. But here's the truth. The version of you you've been defending, it's not you. It's a survival strategy, a bundle of reactions, a constellation of beliefs absorbed from parents, teachers, culture, trauma, television, Instagram quotes, and half-remembered childhood experiences. It's a patchwork identity sewn together from other people's expectations and your deepest fears of rejection. And yet, this false self, this illusion of self-awareness, becomes your compass. It guides who you love, what you chase, what you avoid, and even what you think is possible. Have you ever caught yourself saying, "I've always been like this"? Pause. Ask yourself, who taught you that? Who benefits from you staying that way? And what happens if you stop believing it? Because beneath all the noise, all the programming, there is a deeper self, the one who's been watching, the one who notices your thoughts but isn't made of them, the one who feels but isn't defined by the feeling. You've glimpsed this self before, in moments of stillness, awe, or heartbreak. That fleeting sense that you are more than your name, your body, or your pain. That quiet awareness that notices your life without clinging to the script. But we lose that connection quickly. The world pulls us back into performance, into personality, into roles. You become the achiever, the fixer, the outsider, the strong one, the broken one. And those roles become armor. You forget their costumes. And because everyone around you is wearing theirs too, you begin to think this is just what life is. A masquerade of people pretending to know themselves while secretly afraid of what they'd find if the mask ever slipped. So let me ask you a question no one ever dared to. Who are you when you're not performing? When there's no one left to impress, no role left to play, no script to follow, who remains? Not your job, not your relationship status, not your traumas or your trophies. Strip it all away and what do you find? Most people can't answer, not because they're unintelligent, but because the modern world doesn't want you to know. If you truly knew yourself, your unshakable worth, your boundless awareness, your inner freedom, you wouldn't be controllable. You wouldn't be predictable. You wouldn't buy products to fix problems that were never yours to begin with. Self-ignorance is profitable. and they've made a science of keeping you asleep. You were taught to find yourself through mirrors, other people's reflections, validations, or rejections. But a mirror can only show you what you've already accepted. It can't show you the depth of who you are. That discovery, the real discovery, can only happen when you stop seeking approval and start asking deeper questions. Not questions that have tidy answers, but questions that open you. Who am I beneath this thought, beneath this fear, beneath this lifelong need to prove something? When you start asking those questions, your reality starts to shift. The illusions begin to crack. The identities you've clung to like lifeboats start to feel unnecessary, and in their place, spaciousness, possibility. A still, sacred place where you don't have to be anything to be enough. You simply are. That's not philosophy, that's the beginning of awakening. But before you can fully wake up, you have to admit that you've been asleep. You think you know yourself, but you don't, not yet. And that's the most important realization you'll ever have. Because the moment you realize you don't know yourself is the moment you finally begin. You live your life believing you're in control. You make decisions, set goals, respond to situations, and assume that your logic is sound, that your thoughts are yours, your choices deliberate, your actions intentional. But what if I told you that behind every move you make, there's a hidden machine quietly running the show? A network of unconscious patterns, biases, and invisible programming that dictates how you see the world, how you treat others, and even how you see yourself. The truth is, most of your life is not lived by choice. It's lived by script. You were never given a manual for your own mind. No one pulled you aside and said, hey, by the way, most of your thoughts won't actually be yours. Most of your emotions will be echoes from childhood, and most of what you perceive as truth will be distorted by illusions you didn't even know existed. And so, without ever realizing it, you became a passenger, sitting in the back seat of your own life, while this ancient machine, your subconscious, drives, guides, and decides almost everything for you. This isn't your fault. You were born into a world that prioritized survival over self-awareness. Evolution didn't design your brain to be accurate. It designed it to be efficient. And so, in the name of speed and certainty, it developed shortcuts, mental heuristics, patterns of association, fast-track responses. They help you make sense of a chaotic world. But here's the catch. These shortcuts are full of bugs, full of distortions, full of biases, and most of them are so deeply embedded you don't even know they're operating. Take confirmation bias, for example. The brain's habit of filtering reality to support what you already believe. It doesn't care if the belief is true, it only cares that it feels familiar. So if you think you're unlucky, you'll subconsciously seek out signs of failure, sabotage your own progress, and dismiss any evidence that suggests otherwise. If you believe people are selfish, you'll fixate on the betrayals, the rejections, the moments of indifference, all while ignoring the acts of kindness sitting right in front of you. Your brain isn't showing you reality. It's showing you your version of reality, one edited and curated by beliefs you often didn't choose. And those beliefs, most of them were planted early, long before you had the tools to question them. From ages 0 to 7, your brain is in what's called theta dominance, a highly suggestible state. This is the same brainwave state used in hypnosis. During these years, you weren't learning so much as absorbing. You absorbed your parents' fears, their rules, their unspoken resentments. You absorbed the tone of their silence, the weight of their expectations, the shame they carried without words, and all of it became part of the operating system now running your adult life. You think you're making choices, but often you're just following code. This code influences everything, from who you trust, to what you avoid, to why you keep repeating the same relationships in different bodies. It's the reason you keep getting triggered by the same situations, the reason you keep sabotaging your own growth, the reason you feel stuck even when everything should be working. It's not that you're broken, it's that the machine is running outdated software, and you've mistaken it for truth. But the machine isn't just old, It's clever. It hides its presence behind feelings that feel absolute. You don't say, I'm experiencing a moment of fear shaped by early attachment trauma. You say, this just feels wrong. You don't say, I'm reacting based on unresolved wounds from my father's absence. You say, I just don't trust people like that. The machine doesn't announce itself. It whispers, it nudges, it reroutes your choices through fear, memory, and survival instinct, and then convinces you that you're being rational. It uses mental illusions, biases as its tools, like the anchoring effect, where your brain fixates on the first piece of information it receives and uses it as a reference point, even when it's irrelevant. Or the halo effect, where your mind assigns positive qualities to someone just because you liked one thing about them. Or the illusion of control, where you think you're steering the outcome of things that are actually random. Each of these biases creates a funhouse mirror, bending what you see, distorting what you feel, until your perception becomes a carefully crafted hallucination. And yet, you rarely question it, because the machine is persuasive. It wraps itself in confidence. You say, I just have a gut feeling, or I just know what I saw. But what if your gut is miscalibrated? What if what you saw was filtered through 5 different mental lenses, each one tinted by past pain, fear of rejection, and an unconscious desire to avoid discomfort? The most dangerous part of this hidden machine is that it protects itself. It builds narratives that explain your behaviors in ways that feel noble. You don't say, I'm avoiding vulnerability because I'm afraid of being hurt again. You say, I'm just being independent. You don't say, I'm terrified of being seen as ordinary. You say, I have high standards. The machine doesn't just run your mind, it edits your story and makes the story flattering enough that you never stop to question it. But if you're brave enough to pause, if you're willing to look beneath the surface of your thoughts, beneath the certainty of your reactions, you'll start to see it. The scripts, the loops, the ancient programs that were never really yours. You'll begin to realize that the voice in your head, the one that's always commenting, predicting, warning, that voice is not your truth. It's your training, your conditioning, your protection strategy. And when you see that, something remarkable happens. You start to find the gap, the space between stimulus and response. The moment where the machine wants to react, but you don't. You observe instead. And in that moment of observation, you break the spell. You become conscious, aware, awake. You step out of the machine and into yourself. You've spent your whole life believing you're the driver. But the truth is, you've been the passenger. And that's not shameful. That's human. What matters now is this. Will you keep pretending you're in control, or will you begin to actually take the wheel? Because the moment you become aware of the machine is the moment it begins to lose its power. You like to think of yourself as rational, logical, reasonable. When you make a decision, you believe it's the result of careful thinking, a weighing of pros and cons, a deliberate process of arriving at the best outcome. You trust your mind to analyze, to calculate, to get things right. But the truth is, that belief is an illusion. A comforting story your brain tells to protect itself from the chaos of uncertainty, because in reality your thoughts aren't rational, they're reactive, and the mind that you trust so much to make sense of the world is more often than not lying to you. You weren't built for logic, you were built for survival. Your brain evolved to detect threats, not to uncover truth. It learned to prioritize speed over accuracy, emotion over evidence, safety over exploration. That's why you react before you think. That's why fear speaks louder than facts. That's why a single memory of embarrassment can override 100 moments of confidence. Your mind, as miraculous as it is still rooted in ancient wiring, and it carries the same glitches, the same shortcuts, the same illusions that once helped your ancestors avoid predators, but now sabotage your peace. Every day you walk through a minefield of irrational decisions disguised as reasonable ones. You choose based on emotion, then dress it up with logic after the fact. You feel drawn to someone, and then you create a story about shared values. You dislike someone, and then you list reasons that weren't even conscious until the feeling arrived. This isn't deception. It's how your mind operates. Emotion comes first, justification follows, and by the time you explain your reasoning to yourself or others, you truly believe it was the logic that led the way. But that's the trick. That's the lie of rational thought. Take a moment to reflect on the last time you changed your mind, really changed it because of cold, hard facts. Not because you were emotionally moved, not because you felt seen, respected, or safe enough to consider another view, but because raw evidence forced your logic to shift. It's rare, isn't it? Because evidence doesn't move people, emotions do. And when logic threatens your identity, your tribe, or your sense of certainty, your brain doesn't open, it locks down, it builds walls, it weaponizes its intelligence to defend itself against anything that feels like a threat to what it already believes. This is why the smartest people can be the most stubborn. Intelligence doesn't make you more objective, it just gives you better tools to rationalize your biases. You don't use your mind to find the truth, you use it to defend the truths you've already decided on. And the more intelligent you are, the more convincing your arguments become. You end up trapped in a beautifully constructed cage of your own making, so confident in your reasoning that you can't see the irrational fears driving it underneath. Your mind is filled with what psychologists call cognitive distortions, predictable errors in thinking that warp how you interpret reality, like the sunk cost fallacy, where you keep investing in something because of how much you've already invested, not because it makes sense now. Or loss aversion, where the pain of losing something feels twice as strong as the joy of gaining it. These distortions are baked into your nervous system. They don't ask your permission. They don't knock before entering. They simply shape your perceptions, mold your judgments, and convince you that you're seeing the world clearly, when in fact, you're looking through a lens that's been scratched by every fear, every wound, every piece of conditioning you've ever known. Even your memory, the foundation of your identity, isn't logical, it's selective, malleable, easily influenced by suggestion, repetition, and emotion. You don't remember what happened. You remember your version of what happened, and that version changes over time depending on how you feel when you recall it. Your brain isn't a courtroom, it's a storyteller, and logic is not the narrator. Emotion is. It decides what details matter, what gets highlighted, what gets buried. And every time you retell the story, the brain edits it again, until the truth becomes a mosaic of feelings pretending to be facts. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the illusion is this. It convinces you that you're different, that you are the exception, that everyone else might be irrational, reactive, emotionally compromised, but not you. You're reasonable. You see clearly, you make sound decisions, and the more you believe that, the less curious you become, the less you question yourself, the more you entrench, and slowly, without realizing it, you become the very thing you fear in others. Blind to your blind spots, certain in your self-deception. So what do? You don't throw away your mind, you don't stop thinking, you wake up to how you think. You become suspicious of your certainty. You hold your conclusions loosely. You learn to pause before reacting. You start asking questions like, what am I afraid would happen if I changed my mind? Or, what emotion might be underneath this opinion? Or, am I trying to understand or just trying to win? These are the kinds of questions that logic alone will never ask, but they're the ones that pierce the illusion. Rational thought isn't the villain, but it's not the hero you were told it was either. It's a tool, powerful when used with awareness, dangerous when used as a mask for emotion. And the moment you start seeing that is the moment you stop being its victim. Because once you understand that your mind doesn't always operate logically, you stop treating your thoughts like facts. You stop defending every belief as if it defines you. You begin to think about your thinking, and that is where freedom begins. The lie of rational thought is that it tells you you're in control. But the deeper truth is that you're not fully in control until you see how often you've been fooled. And the willingness to see that, without shame, without defense, is not weakness. It's the beginning of mastery. You probably think you see people clearly. You read their expressions, decode their tones, analyze their silences. You believe you understand their intentions, their insecurities, their games. And maybe you do, to a point. But here's the catch. You also believe they can't possibly understand you with the same depth. You're convinced your thoughts are too nuanced, your motives too layered, your internal world too complex for anyone to really grasp. This is the illusion of asymmetric insight, the quiet, convincing lie that you understand others better than they could ever understand you. This illusion doesn't scream, it whispers. It shows up in conflict, in judgment, in your closest relationships. When someone criticizes you, your mind rushes to defend. They don't get where I'm coming from. But when you criticize them, it feels justified. I've watched their patterns, I know their type, I can see through the act. You give yourself the benefit of context. You give others the blunt force of assumption. You see your anger as layered, but theirs as overreaction. You frame your mistakes as lessons, but theirs as proof of character. And little by little, without even meaning to, you place yourself above, not in status, but in perceived self-awareness. Think about how often you've done this. You see someone being standoffish and you think they're arrogant. You see someone oversharing and you assume they're desperate for attention. You hear a friend speak with certainty and you label them close-minded. But when you do the same things, there's always a reason. You were quiet because you were anxious, not rude. You overshared because you needed connection, not validation. You spoke firmly because you were passionate, not rigid. The illusion paints you in color and everyone else in black and white. Ahead. And the more you believe in your ability to read others, the more this illusion solidifies. You become confident in your interpretations. You see people not as they are, but as the mental versions of them you've constructed, shaped by your past, your pain, your preferences. You think you're seeing clearly, but you're actually projecting. Every time someone reminds you of someone else, your brain fills in the gap. It assumes motives that haven't been revealed. It assigns patterns that haven't actually repeated. It builds entire personalities out of fragments and expressions, and then convinces you that what you're seeing is reality. This illusion isn't just misleading, it's damaging, it erodes empathy. Because how can you truly listen to someone if you've already decided who they are? How can you hold space for their experience if you've already filled in the blanks with your own assumptions? You stop being curious, you stop asking, you stop seeing the person in front of you and instead engage with a version of them that lives entirely in your mind. And the worst part is, they're doing the same thing to you. While you're busy interpreting them, they're busy interpreting you. Both of you convinced that your version is more accurate. You may not realize it, but this illusion isolates you. It creates distance in your relationships. It makes you feel unseen, misunderstood, even lonely. Not because others can't connect, but because you've already decided they can't. You've pre-written the story. They wouldn't understand. So you withhold, you stay vague, you protect your internal world like it's too fragile, too sacred, too complicated. But what if it's not? What if others are more capable of understanding you than you allow them to be? The illusion of asymmetric insight isn't about intelligence, it's about ego. The subtle need to feel special, mysterious, slightly more aware. It flatters you by making you the observer rather than the observed. But the truth is, you are just as visible, just as readable, just as human as everyone else. Your face tells stories you think you've hidden. Your tone carries energy you believe is controlled. Your behaviors, especially the ones you repeat, speak louder than your words. You're not a locked vault. You're an open book written in a language others are fluent in, even if you pretend they aren't. And here's the cost of clinging to this illusion. Connection suffers. Because real connection requires humility. It requires the willingness to be known, not just to know. It asks you to drop the performance, to stop orchestrating how others perceive you and to let people in, not just the curated version of you, but the messy, contradictory, ever-evolving truth. The irony is that you long for this kind of connection. You ache to be seen, but the illusion tells you it's not safe. It tells you others are shallow, judgmental, incapable of truly getting you, so you stay armored and then wonder why no one sees the real you. But what if you challenge that belief? What if you stopped assuming you had others all figured out? What if you entered every conversation with curiosity instead of confirmation? You might be surprised by what you discover. You might find that people are more layered than you assumed, just like you. You might notice how much they're carrying, how hard they're trying, how often they've been misread, and in doing so you'll start to dismantle the illusion not just intellectually but viscerally. You'll feel it crumble every time you say, "I don't know them fully," or "maybe there's more to this than I assumed." And when you let go of the need to be the one who understands more, something beautiful happens. You start to feel understood. Not because the world suddenly became wiser, but because you finally opened the door. You allowed yourself to be seen not as a mystery, but as a mirror, reflecting the same fears, the same hopes, the same longing for truth that lives in everyone else. That's when real understanding begins. Not when you mastered the art of reading others, but when you surrendered the illusion that you were ever the only one doing the reading. You're not above the bias. None of us are. But you can step outside it. You can question it. And in that questioning you reclaim something essential. The ability to connect, not through certainty, but through presence. Through listening. Through admitting you might not have the full picture, and maybe, just maybe, neither does anyone else. You think you're being fair. You think you're being rational, but there's a silent force in your mind that distorts everything. A psychological fog that clouds your judgment without warning. It doesn't arrive with a loud crash or a blinking light. It creeps in through your emotions. It shifts the way you think, what you expect, and how you treat others, all without your awareness. This is the empathy gap, and whether you've realized it or not, it has been blinding you your entire life. The empathy gap is simple to describe but devastating in its effects. When you're in one emotional state, calm, angry, afraid, hungry, tired, you drastically underestimate how different your thoughts, decisions, and behaviors would be in another state. Your current emotion feels like the only reality. It feels objective. It feels permanent. But it isn't. Your emotional state is a lens, and it tints everything you see. The problem is, you forget that the lens is even there. When you're calm and collected, it's easy to give advice. It's easy to look at someone else's chaos and think, why don't they just breathe? Why don't they just think logically? But when that chaos floods your own body, when panic grips you, or heartbreak stings, or rage pulses through your chest, the very advice you once gave so freely becomes unreachable. You can't access it. You're no longer the wise observer. You're the storm. And in that storm, nothing feels abstract. Everything feels immediate, urgent, personal. You say things you swore you never would. You believe thoughts you once dismissed. And afterward, when the wave passes, you look back and wonder, what was I thinking? You weren't. Not like your calm self would. You were under the influence not of a drug, but of emotion. And yet you still believed you were being reasonable. You still believed you were seeing clearly. That's the cruelty of the empathy gap. It tricks you into believing your judgment is intact, even when it's hijacked. It makes you confident at the exact moment you should be cautious. It makes you judgmental toward others when they're overwhelmed, and then shocked at yourself when you behave the same way. This illusion affects everything, from the way you handle relationships to how you respond to news, arguments, temptation, and even your own dreams. In moments of peace, you commit to change. You say, I'm done with toxic people. I'm going to eat better. I'll never let them treat me like that again. But when the emotional state shifts, when loneliness creeps in, or stress builds, or desire whispers in your ear, those promises evaporate, and then you criticize yourself for being weak. But you weren't weak. You were simply in a different state. A different version of you was in the driver's seat. And they didn't care about your past declarations. They were reacting in real time to real emotion. And they weren't listening to logic. That's why the empathy gap isn't just about how you misjudge others. It's about how you misjudge yourself. You don't account for how much your state affects your choices. You don't realize how temporary truths feel permanent when you're under their spell. When you're sad, hope seems naive. When you're angry, compassion feels fake. When you're in love, red flags look like roses. Your brain edits reality to match your feelings and then convinces you that what you're seeing is real. And when you're not in that state anymore, you can't truly remember what it felt like. You can describe it, you can analyze it, but you can't embody it. You say things like, "I don't know why I was so upset," or "that craving doesn't even make sense now," or "I should have handled that better." But that reflection is done from a different mental landscape. And you forget that when the emotion returns, so will the blindness. This illusion is dangerous in relationships, because when someone else is drowning in emotion and you're not, you forget how overwhelming it can be. You forget how irrational you become when you are afraid or hurting. So instead of compassion, you offer judgment. Instead of support, you offer solutions. And when they don't respond the way you want, you assume they're being difficult. But they're not. They're just in a state you can't fully access from where you are, and unless you've been there recently, deeply, viscerally, you'll underestimate it. You'll forget how real fear feels when it's not theoretical. You'll forget how heavy sadness becomes when it's pressing on your chest instead of someone else's. You do the same to yourself. You expect consistency in a brain built for fluctuation. You expect the calm you to govern the fearful you, the logical you to overpower the lustful you, the wise you to override the impulsive one. But your mind doesn't work like that. It's not a single voice, it's a chorus. And the loudest voice in the room is always the one aligned with your current emotion. The empathy gap teaches you this. Your emotional state is not just a background condition, it's a filter, a puppeteer, a hidden director rewriting your script in real time, and the more you deny that, the more power it has. But if you can remember, truly remember, that your thinking will change as your feeling does, you begin to create space. You begin to pause before reacting. You begin to ask, am I thinking this way because it's true, or because it feels true right now? That one question can break the trance. That one moment of awareness can save you from saying something you'll regret, from making a decision you'll undo, from misjudging someone who just needed to be seen. There is no cure for the empathy gap, it's part of how your brain is wired. But awareness takes the edge off, humility opens the door, and practice builds the habit. You won't always see it in time, but more and more you'll catch yourself. You'll remember that how you feel is not the whole story, and you'll give yourself and others the grace to be human in a mind that's always shifting. That's how empathy begins. Not by always knowing what someone else feels, but by knowing how easy it is to forget. Right now, the way you feel seems obvious, logical, grounded. Maybe you're tired, maybe hopeful, maybe anxious or inspired, whatever it is. It feels like a natural response to your current reality. But here's the illusion. Your mind isn't just experiencing the moment. It's projecting it. It's taking how you feel right now and assuming that this feeling will continue indefinitely, that it's stable, that it reflects who you really are, and that your future self will feel and think exactly the same way. This is projection bias. And it's one of the most subtle, most deceptive tricks your brain plays on you. When you're full, you think you'll never overeat again. When you're lonely, you believe you've always been alone. When you're angry, you can't imagine ever forgiving. And when you're inspired, you assume you'll keep that momentum forever. But none of that is true. These emotions are temporary. They're weather systems, not permanent climates. But when they arrive, they bring a kind of amnesia, a mental fog that convinces you that what you feel in this moment is how you'll feel tomorrow, next week, forever. You forget that your emotional state is fluid. You forget that moods shift, that clarity returns, that despair lifts. Instead, you interpret the now as if it's the forever. Think about how many decisions you've made based on projection bias. How many times you said yes to something because you were feeling confident in the moment, only to dread it later when the emotion faded. How many times you lashed out, burned a bridge, or gave up on something because the version of you in that emotional state couldn't see beyond it. In that moment, it didn't feel like a temporary feeling. It felt like truth, like logic, like certainty. But it wasn't any of those things. It was a snapshot of your internal state, frozen in time and mistaken for the whole picture. This illusion doesn't just distort your future, it distorts your past. When you're sad, you remember events through that lens. A breakup seems inevitable. A mistake feels catastrophic. A success looks meaningless. You rewrite history to match how you feel now. And just like that, the past isn't what it was. It becomes what you feel it was. You convince yourself you were always this way, that the hope you once had was naive, that the love you once gave was foolish. But that's not true. That's the present rewriting the past. That's projection bias, quietly erasing everything that doesn't match your current state. It doesn't stop there. You project your present onto your future too, and not just emotionally but behaviorally. You make promises, you overcommit. You assume your future self will be as energized, as motivated, as focused as you are now. And when that future self arrives, tired, distracted, overwhelmed, you blame them for not measuring up. But they were never consulted. They were never part of the decision. You made choices without considering that you'd eventually change. You treated your temporary high as a permanent identity. The irony is that when we finally realize how much we've changed, it surprises us. We look back and say, I don't recognize who I was then, not realizing we're doing the same thing now. We assume our current identity is the final version, that the way we think and feel now is our most evolved, most accurate, most real self. But every past version of you thought the same thing. And every future version of you will too. That's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of being human. But projection bias makes you forget that. It makes you underestimate how intense your emotions can become when you're not feeling them. You say things like, I'd never do that. I'd never fall for that. I'd never get that angry. But you would, you have, and you will again. Because when the emotional storm hits, it hijacks your reasoning. It narrows your vision. It convinces you that what you feel is the only thing that matters, and that it has always mattered this much. It makes temptation feel irresistible, pain feel permanent, and urgency feel justified. Then, when the storm passes, it leaves you in the aftermath wondering how you could have believed the things you did. But here's the hidden cost. Projection bias doesn't just fool you, it makes you unkind. It makes you intolerant of others' behavior because when you're calm, you forget what it's like to be overwhelmed. When you're motivated, you can't understand why others aren't. When you feel secure, you lose patience for those who are afraid. And instead of compassion, you offer criticism. Instead of support, you offer judgment. You forget that they might just be in a state you've been in, or will be again. You forget that how you feel isn't proof of who you are. It's just where you are. And the same is true for them. So how do you break the illusion? You start by remembering that every emotion carries an expiration date. No matter how loud it gets, no matter how real it feels, it will pass. And when it does, your perception will shift. You'll see more clearly. You'll remember what you forgot. You'll realize you weren't as certain as you thought. That's not failure, that's wisdom. The more you notice the pattern, the rise and fall of feeling, the temporary nature of mood, the less tightly you grip your reactions. You start to say, I'm feeling this now, but I won't always. You create space. And in that space, you give your future self a voice. The truth is, your mind is not a camera, it's a painter, one who changes the colors depending on the lighting inside. And if you take the picture too seriously while the light is dim, you might miss the masterpiece waiting just behind the next shift. That's the power of seeing projection bias for what it is, not a flaw but a feature you must learn to work with. A reminder that you are always changing and that the way you feel now is not the end of your story, it's just one page in a book still being written. There's a voice inside you that whispers things you don't say out loud. It says, they only did that because they wanted something. It says, you can't trust people, they always let you down. It says, everyone has an angle. You might not hear it clearly, but you feel its weight. A quiet suspicion that underlies so many of your thoughts. And it's not because you're broken. It's not because you're bitter. It's because your brain is trying to protect you. This voice is what psychologists call naive cynicism, the tendency to assume that other people are driven by selfish motives, even when they're not. It convinces you that everyone else is playing a game, that no one is being fully honest, and that trusting people is a mistake you can't afford to make. At first glance it seems like wisdom. After all, the world can be harsh, people do lie, you've been betrayed before, so you tell yourself that your caution is intelligence, that your guardedness is strength, that your skepticism is what keeps you safe. But under the surface, something else is happening. You're building walls, quietly, incrementally. And those walls aren't just keeping others out, they're keeping you in, because naive cynicism doesn't protect you from pain. It isolates you from connection. It turns life into a guessing game, where trust is weakness and vulnerability is risk. This illusion becomes especially dangerous when you look at how it operates. It doesn't just assume others are untrustworthy. It assumes you're the exception. You believe your motives are pure, your intentions are good, your heart is in the right place. And you might be right. But when someone else does the exact same thing you do, you question them. You search for hidden agendas. You assign motives they never claimed. If you show up to help a friend, it's loyalty. If they do the same for you, maybe they're trying to get on your good side. If you're late, it's because you were overwhelmed. If they're late, it's because they're disrespectful. You give yourself context. You give others conclusion. Naive cynicism convinces you that other people aren't as deep, as honest or as well-intentioned as you are, and that belief is seductive. It gives you a sense of control. It lets you feel smart. It lets you avoid disappointment. But what it takes away is far greater, because when you assume the worst in others, you disconnect from the best in yourself. You start living in defense. You stop expressing love unless it's safe. You stop offering forgiveness unless it's earned. You stop showing up fully. Because what's the point, right? If they're just going to take advantage of you, if they're just going to lie, if they're just going to prove you right, then why bother? And so you retreat. Not in big dramatic ways, but in small daily ones. You second-guess a compliment. You hold back a vulnerable truth. You keep conversations surface level and call it maturity. But underneath it all is a longing, a craving to be seen, to be known, to be held in the kind of trust you've convinced yourself no one else can offer. That's the heartbreak of naive cynicism. It tells you that protecting your heart is more important than opening it, but in doing so it makes you lonely, quietly, slowly, until one day you realize you're surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. What makes this illusion even more insidious is that it often hides behind intellect. You might tell yourself, I'm just realistic, or I've been through enough to know better. But experience doesn't always make you wise. Sometimes it just makes you guarded. And the more you rehearse those beliefs, the more you focus on the betrayals, the lies, the disappointments, the more your brain filters for them. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect people to be selfish, so you notice every selfish act. You expect them to let you down, so you brace for it and overlook the times they don't. Eventually, you start confusing protection with perception. You think your lens is reality when it's really just fear in disguise. You weren't born this way. You came into the world trusting, open, ready to connect, but somewhere along the line you got hurt. Maybe someone broke a promise, maybe someone walked away, maybe you let someone see you. and they didn't treat that moment with care. So you made a decision, even if unconsciously, never again. And that decision became a lens. And that lens became your worldview. But the danger isn't just that you stop trusting others. It's that you stop allowing yourself to be trusted. You stop offering the kind of presence you secretly wish others would give to you. The cure to naive cynicism isn't blind trust, it's conscious discernment. It's realizing that yes, people are flawed, but they are also complex and kind and full of contradictions, just like you. It's remembering that just because someone could have a hidden motive doesn't mean they do. It's choosing to see context, not just conclusion. It's allowing for the possibility that someone else's silence isn't rejection. It might be fear. That their sharp tone isn't hostility. It might be shame. That their mistake isn't malice. It might just be humanity. When you soften your gaze, you make room for that possibility. You stop scanning for threats. You start looking for truth. You begin to realize that trust is not about guarantees, it's about courage. The courage to see someone clearly and still move toward them. The courage to offer the benefit of the doubt. The courage to say maybe they meant well. Maybe I don't know the full story. And in doing so you begin to create a world where connection becomes possible again. Naive cynicism promises protection, but it costs you intimacy. It builds a fortress that no one can enter, including yourself. But the moment you start to question it, the walls begin to crack. And behind those walls is something aching to be let out. Something that wants to believe again. Something that knows deep down, not everyone is out to get you. Some people are just trying to be loved. Just like you. You walk through life assuming that what you see is what is. That your thoughts reflect truth. That your judgments are grounded in facts. You don't question your perspective because it feels real. It feels obvious. It feels self-evident. But what if I told you that the most dangerous illusion you live under is the one that whispers, your version of reality is the correct one? This is naive realism, the belief that your perception is not a perception at all but objective truth. And once you fall into it, it becomes nearly impossible to separate what's real from what's just yours. Naive realism is seductive because it flatters you. It tells you that your beliefs are grounded, that your values are universal, that if others disagree with you, it must be because they're misinformed, biased, irrational, or worse, malicious. You don't consider that they might be seeing something you're not. You don't entertain the idea that your mental map might be incomplete. You just assume that if they knew what you knew, if they were as awake or intelligent or moral as you are, they would agree with you. And if they don't, they must be the problem. This mindset fractures relationships. It creates invisible walls between you and other people, not because of what's true, but because of what feels true to you. It poisons dialogue before it even begins. Because if you believe you see reality as it is, then anyone who challenges you isn't offering perspective, they're threatening reality itself. You stop listening, you dig in your heels, you confuse disagreement with disrespect. And the more convinced you are of your own clarity, the less curious you become about anyone else's. But here's what you forget. Perception is not passive, it's active. Your brain doesn't record reality like a camera. It filters it. It edits, interprets, enhances, and deletes, all without asking for your permission. What you notice, what you ignore, what you remember, what you feel, all of it is shaped by your mood, your history, your trauma, your culture, your expectations, your beliefs. And then your mind wraps all that up and tells you, this is the truth. But it's not the truth. It's your truth, a version, a sliver. A map drawn from a single vantage point, pretending to be the whole territory. Naive realism turns that map into a fortress. You stop exploring, you stop expanding, you defend your walls with logic and passion and pride, and the more emotionally charged your truth becomes, the more threatening other views feel. You lose the ability to distinguish between someone challenging your belief and someone attacking your identity. You take it personally. You react, not because you're weak, but because your mind is wired to equate disagreement with danger. And the more convinced you are that your lens is clean, the more blind you become to your own distortions. You see this every day, in politics, in relationships, in online arguments that devolve into rage. Two people, each convinced they're being reasonable, each certain they're right, talking at each other but not to each other. And beneath the noise is this illusion: if only you saw what I see, you'd agree with me. But we don't all see the same thing. We don't all feel the same thing. Because we're not experiencing the same internal world, even if we share the same external one. You might think this illusion doesn't apply to you, that you are the exception. But that's part of the illusion too. You can see the bias in others with such clarity. You notice when they're projecting, generalizing, reacting emotionally, but when you do the same, it feels justified, it feels different. Because you're not aware that you're looking through a lens. And that's what makes naive realism so dangerous. It doesn't feel like an illusion. It feels like common sense. It disguises itself as truth. It hides in your confidence. This illusion creates a false sense of superiority. You begin to believe that you've earned your perspective through hard experience, thoughtful reflection, or deep education. And maybe you have. But so has the person on the other side. And if you can't admit that, if you can't hold space for the idea that someone else's lived reality might contradict your own and still be valid, then you're not seeing truth. You're clinging to ego. You've mistaken your path for the only path, your pain for the only pain, your clarity for the only light. Naive realism doesn't just cause division. It causes disillusionment. Because when you believe your view is the truth, the world starts to feel increasingly wrong. People start to feel irredeemable. Dialogue starts to feel pointless. Hope starts to feel naive. You retreat, not just from those who disagree with you, but from your own capacity to grow. You stop learning. You stop evolving. You double down. And you confuse rigidity with righteousness. But here's what's real. Your mind is not a mirror. It's a filter. And every filter leaves things out. That's not failure. That's humanity. The problem isn't that we all see the world differently. The problem is believing that we don't. Real clarity doesn't come from doubling down on your beliefs. It comes from loosening your grip. From saying, this is how I see it and I might be wrong. That's not weakness, that's power. Because the moment you admit your perception is partial, you become free to expand it. You become open. You begin to listen, not to defend, but to understand. You stop needing to be right and start needing to be real. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the illusion finally breaks. Not through more arguments, not through louder facts, but through humility. Through the simple, radical act of saying, my perspective is not reality. It's just one window in a house with many rooms. You probably believe that if someone just had the right information, they'd change. That if you laid out the facts clearly, calmly, reasonably, people would wake up, see the truth and shift their thinking. Maybe you've even tried. Sent someone an article, presented data, shared a documentary, or explained your point in detail, only to watch them dig their heels in deeper. Instead of thanking you for the clarity, they got defensive. Instead of considering the facts, they doubled down. And the worst part? You've done it too. Because when your beliefs are challenged, logic doesn't take the wheel, emotion does. And your brain, despite its sophistication, is not nearly as open-minded as you'd like to believe. This is the backfire effect, one of the most frustrating and deeply rooted cognitive illusions you live with every day. The backfire effect is the psychological phenomenon where, when confronted with evidence that contradicts your deeply held beliefs, you don't change your mind, you strengthen your original belief. You push back, you rationalize harder, you defend your stance with even more conviction. It's not about truth, it's about identity. Because by the time a belief has taken root, it's not just something you think, it's something you are. And any threat to that belief feels like a threat to your very self. This is why debates rarely end in understanding. It's why shouting matches over politics, religion, values, or even health choices often leave both sides more entrenched than before. You think the other person is being unreasonable, closed-minded, or willfully ignorant, but in their mind, they're protecting something sacred. The narrative that gives their life coherence. And so are you. You might not feel it as pride. You might experience it as clarity, as righteousness, as just being logical. But underneath it all is something more primal: fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being ungrounded. Fear of having to rebuild what you've trusted for so long. To understand how powerful the backfire effect is, you have to understand how your brain processes belief. You don't store facts like files in a folder, you store them in networks of meaning. Every belief you hold is surrounded by emotions, memories, values, and social ties. You don't just believe something because it's true, you believe it because it feels true, and because it fits the narrative you've built about the world and your place in it. So when a contradictory fact enters the scene, it's not just an inconvenience, it's a disruption. And your brain reacts the same way it would if you were physically threatened, with resistance, adrenaline, and the urgent need to restore control. Think about how hard it is to change someone's mind about something they feel morally invested in. Now realize that you're no different. Even when you pride yourself on being open-minded, you're still vulnerable to the backfire effect. You interpret new information through your existing framework. You highlight what supports your view and downplay what contradicts it. You seek sources that confirm what you already believe, and when someone pushes against your certainty, even gently, you feel the urge to push back, not because you're arrogant, but because you're human. The internet has amplified this illusion. In a world where every belief has its own echo chamber, you can easily surround yourself with people, sources, and narratives that reinforce what you already think. And the more repetition you hear, the more familiar an idea becomes, and the more familiar it feels, the more true it seems. That's not rationality, that's pattern recognition, and your brain is wired to confuse familiarity with accuracy. So when someone brings a different perspective, it doesn't feel refreshing, it feels jarring, even offensive. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. This is why so many arguments escalate, even when they're based on facts, because it's never just about the data. It's about identity, emotion, and tribal loyalty. And when you feel your identity is under attack, your mind stops absorbing information and starts building a defense. It rewrites history, reinterprets evidence, and recasts the messenger as the enemy. The facts don't just fail to convince you, they push you further away. So how do you escape this trap? You start by acknowledging it in yourself. You admit that changing your mind isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's an emotional one. It takes humility. It takes discomfort. It takes the willingness to let go of being right in order to see more clearly. And it takes trust, not just in the person you're listening to, but in your own ability to evolve without losing yourself. When you feel yourself tightening, defending, preparing to argue, pause. Ask yourself, what part of me feels threatened right now? And more importantly, what would it mean about me if I were wrong? That's the question the backfire effect is always trying to avoid, because being wrong feels like a kind of death, a death of certainty, a death of safety. But on the other side of that death is something far more powerful: rebirth, growth, a deeper, wider perspective that's no longer held hostage by the need to be right. And when you're the one trying to reach someone else, remember that facts alone won't break through. What opens minds is not logic but safety. People don't change when they feel attacked. They change when they feel understood, when they're seen not as problems to be fixed, but as people to be heard. The moment you let go of trying to win and instead try to connect is the moment the backfire effect begins to lose its grip. The truth is, changing your mind doesn't make you weak. It makes you brave. And recognizing the backfire effect, in yourself and in others, is not a reason to despair. It's a reason to approach conversations with more compassion, more patience, and more humility. Because the real transformation doesn't come from defeating someone's argument. It comes from creating the kind of space where both of you can grow. And in that space, facts stop being weapons. They become invitations. Invitations not to be right, but to be free. You've said it before. Maybe not out loud, but inside your head. In the heat of emotion. They made me feel this way. It slips out easily, after an argument, after a betrayal, after someone's words land like daggers in your chest. You feel anger rise, or sadness sweep over you, or shame curl in your stomach, and your mind immediately reaches for a cause. You point to the person, the message, the look, the tone, and just like that, you hand over your power. Because in that moment, you've convinced yourself that someone else created your inner experience, that your emotions are not yours, but theirs. This is the false agency illusion, the quiet, constant belief that others are responsible for how you feel, and it's one of the most disempowering traps your mind can fall into. The illusion feels justified. When someone insults you, you hurt. When someone abandons you, you ache. When someone lies to you, you feel betrayed. So naturally you assume they caused your pain, that they triggered it, that they're to blame for what's happening inside you. But here's the truth your ego resists. No one can directly insert a feeling into your body. What they say, what they do, it may spark something, but it's you who interprets. You who assigns meaning. You who reacts. The feeling is yours. The story behind it is yours, and so is the power to shift it. That doesn't mean you're to blame for how you feel. This isn't about self-blame. This is about self-responsibility. A deep, honest reckoning with the fact that your internal world is not a mirror of other people's behavior. It's a reflection of your own beliefs, your wounds, your conditioning. When someone criticizes you, and it hurts, the hurt isn't just about the words. It's about what those words touch inside you. Maybe it's a fear you haven't healed, a narrative you secretly believe, a memory that still stings. The trigger is external, but the activation is internal. And until you see that, you stay stuck, powerless, at the mercy of everyone else's moods, opinions, and projections. The false agency illusion turns you into a victim of your own life. Not because you are one, but because your mind tells you that your emotional state depends on other people getting it right, on them treating you well, on them saying the perfect words, holding the perfect boundaries, never stepping on your sensitivities. And when they inevitably fail, because they're human and flawed and operating from their own distortions, you feel tossed around, like your peace is something fragile that anyone can shatter. Like your worth is a glass someone else forgot to handle carefully. You start to believe that healing means controlling the environment, that growth means finding only safe people, that empowerment means never being triggered. But that's not growth, that's dependency dressed up as awareness. True power doesn't come from avoiding discomfort. It comes from learning how to meet it without losing yourself. And that starts by owning your emotional experience, all of it. Not to bypass it, not to suppress it, but to understand that it belongs to you, and if it belongs to you, you can work with it, you can transmute it, you can choose how long it stays and what story it carries. When you believe someone made you angry, you're implying that anger was inevitable. But was it? Could you have paused? Could you have responded instead of reacted? Could you have questioned the story that flared up in your mind? When you believe someone made you feel worthless, you're reinforcing the very belief that needs healing. Because if their words landed, it's not just because they were cruel. It's because a part of you already wondered if they were true. That's not your fault. That's your invitation. An invitation to look inward, to find the root, to reclaim the part of you that gave your power away in that moment. The illusion of false agency keeps you small. It keeps you reactive. It convinces you that your healing depends on other people changing, on the apology you're waiting for, on the validation you were denied, on the closure that may never come. And so you wait, you stall, you place your evolution in someone else's hands, often the same hands that dropped it in the first place. But what if you stopped waiting? What if you decided right now, that no one else needs to change for you to be free. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior. It doesn't mean tolerating disrespect. It means separating what happened from what you choose to carry. It means realizing that the pain is real, but the permanence is optional. That the trigger is valid, but the chain reaction is yours to interrupt. That you can acknowledge someone's impact without handing them the keys to your emotional landscape. Because when you reclaim agency over your feelings, everything shifts. You stop saying, "They made me feel this way," and start asking, "Why did I respond this way?" Not as a judgment, but as an act of liberation. You begin to track your own inner patterns. You start noticing which wounds still pulse, which beliefs still whisper, which stories still hold you hostage. And instead of outsourcing your healing, you come home to it. You make it yours. You become fluent in your emotional language, not because it's easy, but because it's the only place where real power lives. The truth is, people will disappoint you. They will trigger you. They will act out their pain, their confusion, their unhealed past, but they don't own your inner world. You do. And when you finally see that, not just intellectually but viscerally, the illusion breaks. You stop being a prisoner of other people's behavior. You stop living in emotional reaction. And you begin to anchor yourself in a deeper truth. Your emotions are not weapons or wounds, they're messengers. And every one of them is pointing you back to your own center. Back to your own sovereignty. No one else made you feel this way. They opened the door, but you walked through it. And that's not a failure, that's your greatest opportunity. To walk yourself back out. Stronger, wiser, and finally in full command of the story you're here to live. You probably think you're good at judging people, that you know who's attractive, who's confident, who carries charisma. You might believe your instincts are sharp, that you can spot charm from across a room, pick out a leader in any crowd, or tell who really stands out without much thought. But what if your perception wasn't as accurate as you believe? What if it was being manipulated every time you walked into a group, watched a movie scene, or scrolled through photos online? The truth is, your mind is far more susceptible to context than you realize, and one of the most compelling examples of this distortion is something known as the cheerleader effect, the cognitive illusion that people appear more attractive when they're in a group than when they're alone. At first it sounds superficial, a quirk of visual processing, maybe even a funny bar conversation. But the implications run deeper, because the cheerleader effect isn't just about looks. It's about how your brain responds to presentation, to pattern, to the unspoken influence of group context. Your perception isn't just reacting to the person, it's reacting to the frame around them, to the energy of the group, the balance of features, the subtle harmonies that emerge when people are positioned side by side. You think you're evaluating someone in isolation, but you're not. You're evaluating them within an ecosystem of cues your conscious mind doesn't even register. This illusion starts with something simple. When people are grouped together, your brain tends to average their features. It blends faces, softens asymmetries, and fills in gaps. The result is a kind of composite image that appears more balanced, more symmetrical, more appealing. And since your brain is drawn to symmetry and familiarity, it ends up rating individuals within the group more favorably than it would if they were alone. You're not seeing the person as they are, you're seeing them through a lens warped by proximity and pattern. But it doesn't stop at physical appearance. This same illusion creeps into your judgments about personality, status, and intelligence. Someone standing alone might seem awkward or average, but that same person laughing in a group surrounded by others suddenly seems magnetic, interesting, desirable. You assume they must be fun if others enjoy being around them. You assume they must be confident if they're holding attention. You assume, without realizing it, that their social presence validates them, but often it's not the individual you're responding to, it's the context they're in. Your mind is always seeking shortcuts. It wants fast judgments, quick categorizations, and one of its favorite tricks is called associative processing, linking what it sees with what it thinks it means. A person who looks happy while others are happy must be fun. A person dressed well among others must be stylish. A person speaking in a group must be influential. You connect the dots without questioning the picture, and in doing so you assign qualities to people based on nothing more than where they are and who they're with. This illusion creates ripple effects in how you choose friends, who you trust, who you admire, even who you fall for. Because when someone appears desirable within a group, you're drawn to them without always knowing why. You might call it chemistry or intuition, but underneath it is context. It's the lighting of the moment, the framing of the social scene. And what you don't see is how drastically your perception would shift if you saw that same person alone without the amplifying effect of the group around them. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The cheerleader effect doesn't just affect how you view others. It influences how you present yourself. You instinctively want to be seen in the right crowd, in the right setting. You want to be tagged in group photos. You want to be in motion, in connection, in a scene that says belonging, without needing to spell it out. Because a part of you knows, even if you can't articulate it, that context speaks louder than content. That perception is influenced as much by who you're with as by who you are. But this comes with a cost, because when you mistake context for character, you start chasing appearances instead of truth. You start trying to look connected instead of being connected. You confuse proximity with intimacy. You assume that popularity equals value, and you begin to overestimate others, not because your mind is filling in the gaps, and at the same time you might underestimate yourself. You might assume that someone else's charisma makes your quietness less valid, that someone else's visibility means your worth is hidden. But both are illusions, crafted not by people, but by the lens your brain looks through. The cheerleader effect is subtle, but it's powerful. It teaches you that your brain doesn't just perceive reality, it shapes it. It edits what you see based on patterns, surroundings, and unspoken cues. And if you're not aware of it, you'll keep falling for it. Overrating the confident speaker in the group, undervaluing the quiet thinker in the corner, second-guessing yourself because you're not shining in the same way others are. But awareness breaks the spell. Once you know the illusion, you start asking deeper questions. You look beyond the frame. You start to see people and yourself with a clearer eye. So the next time you find yourself drawn to someone in a group, pause. Ask yourself, am I responding to them or to the setting? What happens when I remove the background? Does the connection still feel true? And when you're judging yourself for not standing out, ask, is it because I'm not enough? Or because I'm comparing myself to a version of others shaped by illusion? The more you ask, the more you free yourself. Because behind the layers of context and perception is something far more real: presence. The kind that doesn't need a spotlight or a crowd to shine. The kind that doesn't need illusion to be seen. You've seen the headlines: thousands displaced by a natural disaster, entire communities ravaged by war, millions affected by famine or disease. The numbers are staggering, almost unfathomable. And yet, strangely, they barely move you. But then, you hear one story, one face, one child with a name, one family with a photograph, one tearful voice describing a loss, and suddenly your heart breaks open. You feel grief, urgency, even the desire to act. This is the identifiable victim effect, the deeply rooted psychological bias that makes you care more about the suffering of one person you can picture than about the pain of countless others you can. It doesn't make you heartless, it makes you human. Your brain was never designed to process statistics, it was built for stories. When you hear a number, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000, it registers abstractly. The mind can't hold that much pain at once. It detaches, it intellectualizes. But when a single life is described in vivid detail, when the suffering is personalized, contextualized, humanized, something shifts. You feel it, you imagine it, you identify with it. And for a moment, that one story becomes more emotionally impactful than an entire humanitarian crisis. This illusion creates a strange paradox. The more people suffer, the less you feel. As the scale increases, your empathy doesn't expand, it shrinks. Psychologists call this psychic numbing. Your emotional system wasn't designed to scale linearly with tragedy. Instead, it gets overwhelmed, it shuts down. The same tragedy that would devastate you if it happened to someone close becomes distant when it involves strangers en masse. You know it matters, logically, but emotionally, it doesn't land the same way. You don't feel what you think you should feel. And that gap between head and heart is where the identifiable victim effect quietly operates. Charities, marketers, and media outlets understand this, often better than you do. That's why they focus their appeals on individual faces, not masses. This is Amina. She's 8 years old. She hasn't eaten in 3 days. That single story captures your attention, not because you don't care about others, but because your brain can't empathize in bulk. It needs a focal point, a name, a picture, a narrative. And once it has that, it builds a bridge from their pain to your own compassion. But until it has that, most suffering remains statistical, tragic, but distant. The danger is not in feeling deeply for one person. It's in what you overlook because of it. You may feel more for a single missing child than for the thousands trapped in a collapsing system. You may give more attention to a viral post than to decades of silent suffering. And you may believe you're acting out of empathy, when in fact you're reacting to salience, not scale. The most visible suffering gets the most emotional currency, regardless of scope, and the quieter tragedies, the ones without a compelling headline, the ones too complex to reduce to a single face, go unnoticed. This isn't about guilt, it's about awareness, because when you realize how your empathy works, you begin to question your impulses. You begin to ask, am I moved by the gravity of this, or by the vividness of it? You begin to notice when a single story hijacks your attention, and when countless lives slip quietly into the background. And more importantly, you begin to choose how you respond, not just with your heart but with your awareness intact. The identifiable victim effect also shows up in your daily life, in the stories you tell yourself. Think about how one person's opinion can devastate you while 1,000 compliments barely register. You could be surrounded by support, but if one voice criticizes you, it becomes the only one you hear. That voice has a name, a tone, a story. And so it carries weight. It shapes your perception more than the faceless many. But just like with suffering, this isn't accuracy, it's proximity, vividness, emotional immediacy, and it can skew your entire sense of worth. The same effect can distort how you judge groups. You meet one rude person from a particular background and make assumptions about the whole. You hear one powerful testimony and generalize it to an entire cause. Your mind leaps from one to many, often without realizing it, but it doesn't leap the other way. You don't hear about 1,000 injustices and assume a single person suffered. Your empathy flows best in the direction of the personal, the concrete, the known. So what do you do with this knowledge? You don't try to numb your compassion, you expand it. You train it. You learn to balance your heart with your head. When one story moves you, honor that. But don't stop there. Ask what systems, what patterns, what structures allow that suffering to exist on such a scale. When your emotions latch onto one image, one child, one headline, let that be the doorway, not the destination. Let it point you to the larger truth, the deeper injustice, the silent thousands who don't have a camera or a microphone to amplify their pain. Because real empathy isn't reactive, it's reflective. It doesn't just feel deeply, it sees clearly. And the moment you recognize the identifiable victim effect for what it is, you gain a powerful insight into your own mind. Not to judge it, but to work with it. To notice when your compassion is being steered by salience instead of scale. To ask yourself what's missing from the frame. To widen your lens beyond the single tear-streaked face to the countless others just outside the spotlight, waiting to be seen. You can still be moved by one story. You should be. But don't let that be where your awareness ends. Let it be where it begins. Because behind every single victim you can name are thousands you'll never know, and their suffering is no less real. Your empathy is a gift, but only when you know how it's being pulled, when you learn to steer it back toward the invisible, the forgotten, the massive quiet pain that never made it into the story, but still desperately needs your heart. You like to believe the world is fair, that things happen for a reason, that if you're kind, you'll be treated kindly, that if someone suffers, it must be because of something they did. This belief doesn't usually speak loudly. It doesn't scream. It whispers, in the quiet conclusions you reach when someone struggles, in the subtle comfort you feel when hearing about a tragedy that didn't happen to you. They must have made bad choices, you think. That would never happen to me because I do things differently. It's not cruelty. It's safety. It's the just world hypothesis, the deeply embedded illusion that the world is a balanced system where people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. It makes life feel predictable. It gives you a framework where effort equals reward, where goodness is protection, and where misfortune has a cause you can understand and therefore avoid. It makes you feel like you have control, like you can stay safe if you just follow the rules. But underneath that comfort is a quiet judgment, because if good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, then anyone who's suffering must on some level deserve it. They must have failed, they must have sinned, they must have attracted it. And just like that, compassion gives way to evaluation, tragedy becomes evidence, and you begin to assign blame where there should only be empathy. This illusion is dangerous because it feels moral, it feels responsible. You believe you're honoring cause and effect, that you're recognizing patterns, that you're avoiding naivety, but what you're really doing is protecting yourself from the discomfort of randomness, the unbearable truth that sometimes terrible things happen for no good reason, that innocent people suffer, that evil goes unpunished, that life is not a vending machine where you insert kindness and receive blessings. And because that truth is so destabilizing, your mind creates a softer one. Maybe they brought it on themselves. Maybe I won't if I just stay vigilant. The just world hypothesis doesn't just influence how you see others, it shapes how you treat them. You might pull away from people in pain not because you lack empathy, but because their suffering reminds you that bad things can happen to good people, that the illusion of control is just that, an illusion. And instead of facing that vulnerability, you look for flaws. She should have seen the red flag. People didn't take care of his health. They knew what they were getting into. These aren't always conscious thoughts. They arise like reflexes, little shields to keep your worldview intact. But those shields come at a cost. They create separation. They turn suffering into something to judge instead of something to hold. And they prevent you from truly connecting with others, because connection requires stepping into their pain without needing to explain it, justify it, or fix it. It requires admitting that life isn't always fair, and that fairness isn't a prerequisite for compassion, that someone can suffer deeply and still have done everything right, that someone can fall apart and still be worthy of love, that someone can be crushed by life and it's not their fault. This illusion also turns inward. When things go wrong in your own life, you look for what you did to deserve it. You replay every choice, every moment, trying to find the error. Maybe I wasn't positive enough. Maybe I didn't work hard enough. Maybe I let my guard down. You treat suffering like a sentence, and because you believe in a just world, you believe the punishment must fit some invisible crime. But sometimes there is no crime. Sometimes you did your best. Sometimes it just hurts. Because life is unpredictable and no amount of moral accounting will protect you from being human. Letting go of this illusion doesn't mean embracing chaos. It means embracing compassion. It means replacing the need to understand why someone is hurting with the willingness to be with them in it. It means acknowledging that your safety doesn't come from control. It comes from connection. That the world might not always be fair, but you can be. You can choose to soften instead of harden, to move towards suffering instead of away from it. To see someone in pain and say, I don't need to know the reason, I just want to stand with you in this. There's a quiet cruelty in thinking people get what they deserve. It isolates, it condemns, it reinforces privilege and punishes vulnerability. It makes you turn your gaze from those who need you most, not out of malice, but out of fear. But the truth is, your heart wasn't built for distance. It was built for depth. And when you let go of the belief that the universe is keeping score, you open yourself to a deeper kind of love. You open yourself to a deeper kind of love. A love that isn't earned, a love that isn't conditional, a love that simply shows up because someone is hurting, and that's reason enough. You don't have to make sense of every tragedy. You don't have to resolve the tension between what is and what should be. You just have to remain human in the face of what feels inhumane. To choose empathy over explanation, presence over protection, solidarity over superiority. Because the moment you stop asking, why did this happen to them, and start asking, how can I love them through this? That's when the illusion cracks. That's when the walls fall. That's when you become not just a witness to pain, but a vessel of healing within it. The world isn't fair, but you can be. And maybe that's the most powerful response of all. Not to seek justice in the stars, but to create it in your heart. Not to believe people get what they deserve, but to give what they need anyway, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because the real measure of your humanity isn't how well you calculate karma, it's how deeply you choose to care, even when the math doesn't add up. You do something good, maybe you help a stranger, stand up for a cause, donate to a charity, or speak out in defense of someone else. And for a moment you feel proud, you feel aligned, you feel like a good person. But then something subtle happens. Later that day or the next, you catch yourself acting in ways that don't quite match that earlier virtue. Maybe you snap at someone, maybe you indulge in judgment, maybe you give yourself permission to cut corners, say something unkind, or tune out someone else's pain. And in the back of your mind, without saying it outright, there's a silent justification. I've earned this. This is the moral credential effect. The quiet illusion that doing one good thing gives you license to do something not so good later. It's one of the most deceptive tricks the ego plays, because on the surface it looks like virtue, it feels like integrity, you did the right thing after all, you made a choice that reflects your values, but underneath that pride is a hidden transaction, a psychological sleight of hand. You unconsciously convert your goodness into credit, and then you spend that credit to excuse behavior that contradicts the very thing you stood for. You create a moral buffer, a cushion that makes future missteps feel less wrong, less damaging, less out of character. And you're not alone. This illusion lives in almost everyone. It shows up in the person who supports diversity in public, but privately makes biased assumptions. In the person who talks about kindness, but lashes out when things don't go their way. In the person who speaks out for justice, but turns a blind eye when someone close to them acts unjustly. None of them, none of us, are trying to be hypocrites. It happens quietly, automatically. The moment we define ourselves as good, we begin to protect that identity. And when we do something that threatens it, we reach for past goodness to justify present contradiction. The danger of this illusion is how easily it makes you blind to your own inconsistencies. You think you're being fair, you think you're being objective, but what you're really doing is running moral math, subtracting your flaws from your previous virtues and telling yourself the balance is still positive. You give yourself permission to fall short, not because you've stopped caring about being good, but because you've banked so much credit in your mind that you believe you can afford the slip. It's the same mechanism that allows people to speak cruelly after a good deed, to justify selfishness after sacrifice, to overlook their biases after performing an act of inclusion. The moment you see yourself as the kind of person who, your mind becomes invested in preserving that image, and when your actions don't align, you don't question the image. You rewrite the action. You say it wasn't that bad. You say it was necessary. You say it doesn't count against you because of everything else you've done. And slowly, quietly, the illusion grows. You start to believe your own story. that your past goodness protects you from present accountability, that you don't need to question your behavior because your character is already proven. But that's not how growth works. Growth isn't earned like a trophy. It's practiced like a discipline. It requires vigilance, honesty, the willingness to examine even the things that seem out of place for someone like you. The moral credential effect also has a darker consequence. It makes you judge others more harshly than yourself. You assume that if someone else makes a mistake, it must be who they are. But when you make a mistake, you see it as a moment, one that doesn't define you. Because you've already proven your goodness, you extend grace to yourself, but not always to others. Because you see your own context, your own intentions, your own history. But you see only the snapshot of someone else's misstep. And that disconnect allows the illusion to survive. Even more subtly, this illusion can become strategic. You may begin to do good things not just for their own sake, but so you can feel good, so you can later justify behavior you already suspect is out of alignment. The mind turns morality into a kind of currency, a trade. And the more unconscious this becomes, the more dangerous it gets. Because now you're not just navigating life, you're managing your image. You're building a story about yourself that's harder and harder to challenge, because every time it's threatened, you call up your credentials as proof. But here's the truth. You're not as consistent as you think you are. No one is. And the goal isn't perfection. It's awareness. It's the ability to say, just because I did something good yesterday doesn't mean I'm immune from messing up today. It's the humility to recognize that character isn't something you prove once. It's something you build moment by moment, especially when no one's watching. The most dangerous thing about the moral credential effect is that it makes you stop reflecting. It makes you feel finished. But you're not. You're evolving. You're learning. And every day you're presented with moments to either reinforce your integrity or quietly excuse your deviation from it. The more honest you are about that, the more aligned your life becomes, not because you never slip, but because you see your slips clearly, and you course correct without needing to defend your image. Real integrity doesn't need credentials. It doesn't rely on past virtue to justify present behavior. It doesn't keep score. It stays present. It keeps asking, is this who I want to be right now? And in that question is your power, not to be perfect, but to be real, to be self-aware, to be someone who doesn't just perform goodness, but lives it, quietly, consistently, without needing the illusion that one good thing is enough. Because deep down you already know, your values aren't proven in your best moments, they're revealed in your next choice. You think you're fair, that your opinions come from logic, that your views are shaped by facts, experience, maybe even wisdom. And when you see someone else being biased, twisting the truth, ignoring evidence, reacting emotionally, it's obvious. You spot their double standards, their selective memory, their blind loyalty to a narrative. It's frustrating, sometimes even infuriating, because to you, they're not seeing clearly, they're not being rational, they're being exactly what you pride yourself on not being. But what if I told you that this clarity you think you have, the sense that you see things objectively while others are distorted, is itself a distortion? This is the bias blind spot, and it's one of the most persistent illusions in the human mind. It's easy to see bias in other people. It stands out, it feels exaggerated, emotional, stubborn. You hear their arguments and think, they're just seeing what they want to see. But when you're the one making the argument, when you're the one choosing the evidence, interpreting the facts, explaining your stance, it doesn't feel like bias. It feels like reason, like truth. You believe you've examined both sides. You believe you've weighed the information. You believe you've arrived at your position fairly, and maybe you have. But the very belief that you're less biased than others is often the most dangerous bias of all. The bias blind spot is what keeps you convinced of your own neutrality while silently filtering everything you see through the lens of emotion, identity, and past experience. It allows you to feel superior to others while remaining unaware of the ways your own mind is twisting reality to protect itself. Because that's what bias does. It protects. It cushions your identity. It shields your worldview. It preserves the story you've told yourself about who you are and what you believe, and the more you think you're immune to it, the deeper it runs. This illusion is so pervasive because it feels like self-awareness. You notice other people being irrational, so you assume that noticing makes you rational. You acknowledge the existence of bias, so you believe you've somehow risen above it. But recognizing bias in the world doesn't remove it from your mind. If anything, it often strengthens it, because now you feel justified in dismissing others while reinforcing your own stance as the balanced one. But true objectivity isn't something you declare, it's something you pursue, and it begins by admitting that you're not as neutral as you think you are. Your beliefs didn't form in a vacuum, they were shaped by your upbringing, your environment, your trauma, your education, your culture. You absorbed values before you could name them. You made judgments before you knew what judgment was. And those early imprints color everything you see. Even now, they decide which facts you trust, which voices you amplify, which information you seek out, and which you unconsciously avoid. This isn't deception, it's human nature. Your mind craves coherence. It wants your beliefs to match your identity, so it filters out what doesn't fit and clings tightly to what does. And yet, you continue to assume you're seeing clearly. You accuse others of cherry-picking information while you quietly do the same. You notice when they react emotionally, but dismiss your own defensiveness as passion. You point out their echo chambers, unaware of how your own social feeds, news sources, and conversations subtly reinforce your worldview every single day. And because your mind is so good at rationalizing, you don't see these patterns as bias, you see them as being informed. But here's what makes the bias blind spot so tricky. The smarter you are, the worse it gets. Intelligence doesn't protect you from bias, it helps you defend it. The more articulate you are, the better you are at justifying your stance, finding evidence to support it, and dismantling opposing views. You mistake mental sharpness for clarity, but what you might actually be doing is constructing a more elaborate illusion, one that feels intellectually bulletproof, but is still grounded in emotion and identity. This doesn't make you dishonest, it makes you human. We're all walking contradictions. We all want to believe we're fair while craving affirmation of our existing beliefs. And unless we build the muscle of self-inquiry, we default to the comfortable lie that our perspective is uniquely unbiased, that we're the exception, that we're the rational one in a world of irrational minds. But that belief doesn't lead to clarity, it leads to arrogance, to stubbornness, to broken dialogue and endless misunderstanding. So, what does humility look like in the face of this illusion? It looks like asking, where might I be wrong? And really meaning it. It looks like questioning not just what others believe, but how you came to believe what you believe. It looks like recognizing that your certainty is often a feeling, not a fact. And it looks like being willing to listen, not to win, not to convert, but to understand what it's like to see the world through someone else's lens, even if that lens contradicts your own. Real objectivity doesn't mean having no bias. It means being aware of your bias and working to minimize its influence. It means recognizing that your thoughts are not truth, they're interpretations, that your clarity is not proof, it's a perspective, and that your mind, brilliant as it may be, is not immune from distortion just because it can point out the distortions in others. The most courageous thing you can do isn't to be right, it's to stay curious, to hold your beliefs with both conviction and softness, to recognize that seeing bias in others is easy, but seeing it in yourself is where the real transformation begins. Because once you accept that you too are biased, the world doesn't become more chaotic. It becomes more human. And in that humility, in that willingness to own your blind spots, you open a doorway, not just a deeper understanding of others, but to a clearer, more honest version of yourself. You feel safer, So you take more risks. You buckle your seatbelt and drive a little faster. You wear protective gear and push your body harder. You install security software and stop thinking critically about the links you click. Somewhere deep in your psyche, a strange trade-off is being calculated. The safer you feel, the more permission your mind gives you to flirt with danger. And most of the time, you don't even realize it's happening. This is the risk compensation trap, a psychological illusion that convinces you that safety is a permission slip for recklessness. And it's why, sometimes, the very things designed to protect you end up putting you at even greater risk. This isn't a rare glitch in thinking. It's a deep-rooted pattern wired into the way your brain responds to perceived danger. When something reduces risk, whether it's a law, a warning, a piece of safety equipment, or even a piece of advice, your subconscious often interprets that reduction as room to let go. And what follows is a subtle but profound shift. The behavior you once approached with caution becomes a playground for shortcuts. You take your eyes off the road, you ignore your body's warnings, you trust technology to save you, and without realizing it, you tiptoe closer to the edge, under the illusion that there's a net beneath you. It's not that you want to be reckless, you believe you're being safe, because on paper you are. You've followed the rules, you've taken the precaution, you've checked the boxes. But what you haven't done is adjust your mindset. What you haven't noticed is that the feeling of safety has quietly overpowered the reality of risk. And now, you're more vulnerable than before, not in spite of the protection, but because of it. Think about this on a broader scale. When airbags were first introduced, studies showed a strange trend. People started driving more aggressively. Why? Because the presence of safety made them feel invincible. When people wear helmets, some cycle more recklessly. When drivers see road signs and speed cameras, they sometimes rely on them so much that they stop self-regulating. This isn't just behavioral, it's neurological. Your brain is constantly scanning for danger, and when it believes the danger has been reduced, it reallocates energy. It loosens control. And in that loosened grip, subtle recklessness creeps in. But it's not just about physical safety. This illusion appears in every area of life. In relationships, when someone tells you they'll never leave, you stop tending to the small things. You get comfortable, complacent. You feel secure, and that security makes you lazy with your words, your time, your presence. In health, when you start taking medication or supplements, you might unconsciously neglect the basics: sleep, nutrition, movement. Because your mind tells you the pill will cover the gaps. In finances, when you have a savings buffer, you might make riskier purchases or ignore budgeting habits you once valued. Safety becomes the justification for disengagement. The risk compensation trap feeds off a false narrative. I've reduced the risk so I can stop being careful. But the truth is, most safety measures are meant to support your awareness, not replace it. They're backups, not absolutes. And when you forget that, you turn your safeguards into enablers. You stop listening to your own instincts. You override your better judgment. You become less attuned, less responsive, less awake, not because you don't care, but because your brain has been tricked into thinking it can afford to care less. And here's the twist. The more prepared you feel, the less you prepare. The more protected you feel, the less you protect yourself. This creates a dangerous feedback loop where perceived safety leads to riskier behavior, which in turn increases actual risk, even as your mind feels more in control than ever. You believe you're being responsible, when really you're riding the illusion of protection while drifting further from presence. This illusion is especially dangerous in the spiritual and emotional realms. When you think you've done the work, when you think you've healed, when you feel grounded, you might stop checking in with yourself. You might stop noticing the signs of repressed emotions, misalignment, or fatigue. The identity of being safe or healed becomes a kind of armor, and that armor, ironically, keeps you from noticing the cracks forming underneath. You assume you're beyond certain patterns, so you let them creep back in. You assume you won't fall again, so you stop watching your step. Awareness is the only antidote. Not fear, not paranoia. Awareness, the ability to say, even though I've taken precautions, I still need to stay engaged, I still need to listen, I still need to be mindful. True safety isn't found in the tools you use or the systems you trust. It's found in your attention, in your willingness to stay conscious, to remain present even when everything around you is saying, "You're fine now, you can relax, you don't have to look anymore." That's the moment you do have to look, because that's the moment the trap springs. You don't have to live in fear, but you do have to live awake, because real security isn't about building a life where nothing can go wrong, it's about building a mind that doesn't check out when things feel right. The most dangerous thing about the risk compensation trap isn't the risk itself, it's the belief that the risk is gone. And when you lose your edge loses you. Not because you were careless, but because you trusted the system more than you trusted your own perception. So ask yourself, where in your life do you feel safe? And what has that feeling quietly allowed you to ignore? What habits have you abandoned because something external told you it was okay? Where have you stopped listening because you think you've arrived? The answer to those questions might be the very place your next reckoning waits. Not to punish you, but to remind you. Protection is not permission, and feeling secure isn't the end of responsibility, it's the beginning of deeper awareness. You win once and it feels good. You win twice and it starts to feel deserved. You win 3 times and now something shifts. You tell yourself you're on a roll, that you're in the zone, that luck has nothing to do with it. Maybe it's your strategy, your focus, your energy. Maybe it's alignment or flow. But somewhere deep in your mind, you stop treating your success as individual events and start seeing them as part of a streak, a hot streak. And that belief that the more you win, the more likely you are to keep winning, is called the hot hand fallacy. It's one of the most seductive illusions the brain can fall into, because it feels like momentum, it feels like certainty. But it's actually a distortion, quietly rooted in your craving for control. This illusion has been studied in sports, casinos, business, and behavior, and across each field one thing becomes clear. Once someone experiences a few consecutive successes, they begin to believe those successes are predictive of more success. Not just hopeful, predictive. The basketball player who makes 3 shots in a row is more likely to take the 4th, believing the hand is hot. The investor who picks 3 profitable stocks assumes the next one will perform too. The person who gets 2 job offers in a row expects the 3rd interview to go smoothly. The pattern gets internalized. And the belief, often unconscious, is that success begets success, not because of effort, but because of a kind of streak energy. Like the universe is smiling down, and that smile will last just long enough to ride the wave. The truth is, sometimes it's just randomness. Sometimes you win because the odds were in your favor, or because your timing aligned with external forces you didn't control, or because you were lucky, a word people don't like to use when talking about their own success. But the brain resists randomness. It wants patterns. It wants predictability. It wants to believe that life is less chaotic than it actually is. So when you win, your mind doesn't just record the event. It builds a story around it, a narrative. And if the wins come close enough together, the story becomes a prophecy. I've got the touch. Things are working for me now. I just have to keep going. This isn't always harmful. In some cases, the confidence that comes from this illusion can actually enhance performance. Athletes who believe they're in a flow state may become more focused. Entrepreneurs who feel the energy of success may make bolder, faster decisions. But the risk, and it's a big one, is that you stop distinguishing between skill and streak, between effort and outcome, between logic and momentum. You may take bigger risks without realizing it. You may ignore red flags because things are working. You may bypass caution thinking you're invincible. And eventually the streak breaks. The shot misses. The market turns. The idea flops. And suddenly the illusion collapses. You're left not just with disappointment, but with confusion. Because you thought success meant you would keep succeeding. You thought the wave would carry you. But waves don't carry forever. And when you build your confidence on the illusion of flow rather than the foundation of awareness, its collapse feels personal, like failure instead of correction, like betrayal instead of recalibration. The hot hand fallacy doesn't just affect individuals, it affects how others treat you, too. When people see someone on a winning streak, they often assume competence, they assume brilliance, they assume something must be special about them, and so they invest, they follow, they mimic. They place bets on the person, not realizing they may be betting on a moment, not a movement, and the pressure builds. Now the person who's hot feels like they can't lose because others believe in them, and they begin to believe the myth too. Until something crashes. This illusion also shows up in spiritual disguise. You might feel like you're aligned with the universe because things are flowing. You might interpret synchronicities as signs that you're on the right path. And maybe you are. But alignment isn't measured by ease, it's measured by truth. And sometimes the universe tests your integrity not by sending resistance, but by sending success, to see if you stay grounded in awareness or get swept up in ego. Believing you're on a hot streak makes you less likely to reflect. You stop checking your decisions, you stop analyzing the variables, you stop asking, what's actually contributing to this outcome, because it feels like you already know, you. But humility asks a different question. What else might be at play here? What timing, what chance, what hidden forces? What am I not seeing? What part of this is replicable and what part is not? When you ask those questions, you stay tethered to truth. When you don't, you float into fantasy. There's a difference between trusting your flow and believing you can't fail. One is faith, the other is delusion. Confidence is healthy, but confidence without awareness becomes arrogance, and arrogance blinds you to the fall. The mind that believes it's invincible stops listening, and the moment you stop listening, you stop learning, and the moment you stop learning, your streak, no matter how golden, begins to rot from within. So if you've been winning lately, celebrate. Let the gratitude in. Let the momentum inspire you. But don't let it seduce you. Don't let it tell you that you've mastered luck, that you've hacked reality, that you've earned immunity from the natural cycles of loss and recalibration. Because the universe doesn't owe you another win just because the last one felt good. And your brilliance isn't measured by how long the streak lasts. It's measured by how well you handle the moment it ends. And when it does, you'll have a choice. To chase the illusion again, to force, to overreach, to double down, or to pause, to reflect, to realign, to remember that your worth isn't tied to a streak. It never was. Because true mastery doesn't come from being hot. It comes from being honest, from staying grounded when things are good, from staying curious when they're not, and from knowing that real power isn't in winning, it's in waking up. Every single time, you've struggled for it, so it must be worth it. You've paid in time, in tears, in sacrifice, so it must matter. You look back at everything you gave, your energy, your years, your comfort, and tell yourself it had to be meaningful. Because if it wasn't, what does that say about the pain? What does that say about the nights you stayed up doubting? The days you kept going when your spirit wanted to quit? Your mind cannot sit with the idea that all that effort may have been poured into something hollow. So it builds a story, a rationalization, a way to explain the suffering. It says, this must have been important, because why else would I have given so much of myself? This is the psychological illusion known as effort justification, and it lives deep inside the way you assign meaning to your struggles. It's not a flaw, it's a coping mechanism. When your actions don't align with the outcome, when the result feels less than the cost, your brain scrambles to restore balance. It needs your suffering to mean something. Otherwise, the discomfort becomes unbearable. You can't stand the thought that you endured hardship for something trivial or unworthy. So you reframe it. You elevate the experience. You convince yourself that the sacrifice wasn't just necessary, it was noble. That what you received was profound even if deep down it wasn't. This illusion is everywhere. You see it in relationships where people stay not because love is alive but because they've already given too much to walk away. You see it in careers that drain the soul but are clung to because of the years invested. You see it in beliefs, spiritual, political, personal, that are defended fiercely, not because they still resonate, but because abandoning them would mean admitting that past sacrifices were in vain. The deeper the pain, the stronger the attachment, because when you've suffered for something, you need it to matter, you need it to be sacred. But here's the hidden cost. Effort justification can keep you trapped. It convinces you to double down on things that no longer serve you just to avoid the grief of letting go. It persuades you to cling to illusions rather than face the truth that something might never have been what you thought it was. And it turns your pain into a prison, one you keep locking from the inside because unlocking it would mean confronting a brutal question: what if all this effort wasn't worth it? And yet, that question, painful as it is the doorway to freedom. Because not all struggle is sacred, not all hardship leads to wisdom. Sometimes you suffer simply because you didn't know better, because you believed the wrong promise, because you weren't ready to walk away. And that doesn't mean you're weak, it means you're human. But when you tie your worth to your wounds, you begin to see the suffering as proof of virtue. You think, if it hurt this much, it must mean I'm growing. But not all pain is productive. Sometimes it's just pain. The mind doesn't like that idea, it resists it. Because meaning is its survival mechanism. If it can't turn pain into progress, it spirals into despair. So it starts stitching meaning into the story. It tells you that the degree of suffering equals the degree of value, that because you bled for it, it's sacred. But that logic is flawed. By that standard, anything painful must be worthwhile. But you and I both know that's not true. You can hurt for the wrong things. You can give your life to something empty. You can suffer for illusions, and if you're not careful, you'll glorify that suffering instead of escaping it. There's a subtle ego hook here, too. When you've suffered more than others, you want that suffering to elevate you. You want it to count. You want it to be respected. You want others to understand how deep you went, how much you endured. And so, you start defending the experience, not because it was healthy or wise, but because it became part of your identity. You mistake endurance for enlightenment. But survival isn't the same as transformation, and just because you made it through doesn't mean you have to keep carrying it like a badge. You can release something even if it cost you everything. You can admit that something wasn't what you hoped it would be, without erasing your courage, because your effort was real, your fight was honest. But value doesn't always come from effort. Sometimes it comes from the lesson that the effort was misplaced. And that's not failure, that's maturity. The true power lies in the ability to step back and ask, am I still holding on to this because it's meaningful, or because I suffered for it? That one question can shatter the illusion. It can reveal how many things you've kept in your life not because they're aligned, but because they were expensive. And the truth is, clinging to something that hurt you just because it hurt you doesn't redeem the pain, it extends it. The real healing begins when you stop needing your suffering to justify your choices and start letting your awareness guide your next ones. You don't need to defend your past. You need to liberate your future. And that means honoring your effort without being enslaved by it. That means telling the truth about what's actually working now, not what should have worked based on how hard it was. Because the deepest wisdom often comes not from what we endure, but from what we're willing to release, even after we've given it everything. Especially then. So when you look back and see something that cost you dearly, ask yourself if you're still carrying it because it's still sacred, or just because it once hurt. And if it's the latter, you don't have to keep holding on, you can let go. Not because it didn't matter, but because you matter more. And no illusion, no matter how noble it once seemed, is worth carrying if it keeps you from peace. You crave certainty. You want to know what will happen before it happens, to see your choices laid out like a clear path, to feel some sense of control over the outcomes of your life. And when certainty isn't available, which it rarely is, your mind fills the gap. It reaches for anything that sounds solid, looks confident, or feels definite. It clings to numbers, headlines, confident voices, projected outcomes, and binary choice. It manufactures a sense of stability out of ambiguity. This is the pseudo-certainty effect, a psychological illusion where you overvalue decisions that offer the appearance of certainty even when that certainty is hollow, and undervalue options that feel uncertain even if they're actually more rational. It's how your brain chooses comfort over accuracy, simplicity over truth. And it's how fake certainty ends up creating real consequences. At its core, this illusion is rooted in fear. Uncertainty activates the part of your mind that's constantly scanning for threats. When you don't know what's going to happen, your sense of safety diminishes. You feel ungrounded, unanchored. So you reach for the first thing that promises clarity. That one article, that one expert, that one belief, that one number. You stop analyzing and start gripping. And the tighter you grip, the less room you leave for nuance, complexity, or growth. You tell yourself, I know what's right. I know what's going to happen. But deep down, you're not chasing truth. You're chasing relief. And it works. For a while, that fake certainty soothes your anxiety. It makes you feel in control. It gives you permission to act decisively without second guessing. But the problem is, it distorts your decision-making. It leads you to overestimate the safety of known options even when they're flawed. It pushes you to reject better paths simply because they involve unknowns, as it locks you into a mindset where changing your mind feels like failure because you've already told yourself you were certain. This shows up in every corner of life. You might stick with a career you dislike because it feels stable, even though the long-term risk of emotional burnout is far higher. You might choose a partner out of comfort, believing they're a safe bet, while ignoring the deeper disconnection you pretend not to feel. You might make quick investments based on confident projections rather than deeper research, or avoid a bold move because the numbers don't give you a guarantee. In each case, it's not logic steering you. It's the illusion of control. And it goes deeper. When you're under pressure, especially under threat, your mind doubles down on pseudo-certainty. You move into black and white thinking. You want clear enemies and clear heroes. You want right answers, not questions. You gravitate toward authority figures who speak in absolutes, who sound sure, who don't hesitate. And you avoid those who admit complexity, ambiguity, or doubt, even though those are often the voices telling the truth. Your brain confuses confidence with competence, and in doing so it leads you to place trust in people or systems that may be deeply flawed, simply because they sound certain. The pseudo-certainty effect is amplified in a world of overstimulation. You're flooded with options, data, opinions, choices, and your cognitive bandwidth can't process it all. So your mind takes shortcuts. It oversimplifies. It selects the clearest narrative, the sharpest contrast, the thing that just makes sense, and it locks onto it, not because it's the best, but because it's the least overwhelming. This is how fake clarity becomes seductive. It's not about truth, it's about ease. It's about your brain trying to survive the noise. And the irony is, the more certain you feel, the more blind you become. You stop asking questions, you stop gathering information, you stop challenging your assumptions, because you believe you've already arrived at the answer. You believe you know. And in that certainty you shut the door to learning. You make decisions based on outdated inputs. You overcommit to flawed strategies. You take risks you don't see as risks. And you wonder later why everything collapsed. But it didn't collapse because you were reckless. It collapsed because you mistook clarity for truth, and confidence for wisdom. So, how do you escape the trap? You start by recognizing that certainty is a feeling, not a fact. It's a state your mind enters to relieve discomfort, not necessarily a reflection of reality. And like any feeling, it can be misleading. You learn to pause when something feels too sure. You ask yourself, am I attracted to this because it's right? or because it's clear? That one question can reveal whether you're operating from alignment or from avoidance. You also begin to reframe uncertainty not as a threat but as a companion to truth. Because real truth is rarely absolute. It evolves, it adapts, it resists tidy packaging. And that's not a weakness. It's a sign of maturity. The most intelligent decisions are often made with partial information, involving awareness and the humility to change course. That kind of decision-making doesn't look bold, it looks measured, but it's the kind that lasts. And perhaps most importantly, you learn to live with the discomfort of not knowing, to hold space for the unknown without rushing to fill it, to say, I don't know yet, and let that be enough. Because in that space, you don't just avoid mistakes, you open yourself to something deeper. You stop clinging to illusions and start cultivating discernment. You make peace with uncertainty, not by eliminating it, but by moving through it with your eyes wide open. In a world obsessed with having answers, your power lies in the ability to question. In a culture that worships certainty, your evolution depends on your capacity to doubt with grace. Because the more willing you are to live in the unknown, the more clearly you begin to see, not just the world, but yourself. And in that clarity, not the fate kind, but the quiet, grounded kind, you begin making decisions that aren't just reactive but real, not just confident but wise, not just easy but true. You walk into a room and suddenly you're hyper-aware of your clothes, your posture, your expression. You wonder if your hair is okay, if that awkward moment from earlier is still written on your face. You scan the crowd and feel eyes on you, imagined or real. Every misstep feels magnified, every silence feels loud, every imperfection feels broadcasted. It's not vanity, it's not arrogance. It's a phenomenon wired into your psychology. It's called the spotlight effect. The illusion that other people are paying far more attention to you than they actually are. And it's one of the most subtle traps your mind can fall into, shaping how you behave, what you hold back, and how much pressure you place on simply being yourself. You live your life as the protagonist of your own story, constantly observing your thoughts, your actions, your mistakes. Because you are so immersed in your own awareness, you assume others are equally attuned to what you're doing, how you're showing up, how you're being perceived. But the truth is, most people are too busy being the protagonist in their own story to focus much on yours. They're wrapped up in their own fears, their own performance, their own version of the spotlight. And while you imagine they're noticing every flaw, every stumble, every moment of awkwardness, they're usually not. In fact, they probably don't even remember it happened. This illusion begins early. As children, we learn quickly that our behavior affects how others treat us. We start to internalize the idea that eyes are on us, that we are being watched, judged, measured. As we grow, this awareness deepens, especially in moments of vulnerability, stepping on a stage, making a mistake, walking into a room full of strangers. In those moments, it feels like the lights have turned and the world has stopped to witness our every move. But in reality, most of the world is too preoccupied with its own inner monologue to pay us more than a passing glance. What makes the spotlight effect so damaging is not just the anxiety it produces, but the freedom it quietly takes away. You start editing yourself. You water down your voice. You overthink your actions. You stay quiet instead of speaking up. You don't try the new thing. You don't take the risk. You avoid the conversation, the dance floor, the dream. Not because you lack desire or capacity, but because you assume that failure will be broadcast, that embarrassment will echo, that everyone will remember. But here's the truth. They won't. The thing you obsess over for hours, others forget in minutes. The thing you think defines you, most people don't even notice. This doesn't mean your presence is meaningless. It means that the weight you place on your performance is often disproportionate to how others receive it. That time you said something awkward in a meeting, most people were thinking about their own to-do lists. That moment your voice cracked during a speech, they noticed for a second, then returned to worrying about how they sounded. People are not watching you nearly as much as you think they are, and when they are, They're rarely judging you with the harshness you've internalized. More often than not, they're extending the very grace you keep denying yourself. The spotlight effect also plays tricks in social media culture, where likes, views, and public perception seem to matter more than authenticity. You craft your image with precision, you curate, filter, perform, and still you feel exposed, like one wrong post, one awkward photo, one imperfect caption could unravel the whole thing. But again, most people aren't studying you that closely. They scroll, they glance, they move on. The truth is, the person who replays your mistakes, your flaws, your moments of doubt is you. You carry the weight long after others have let it go, and that weight shapes how you show up or don't. Freedom comes when you realize that the spotlight is an illusion, that you've been holding yourself back based on imagined judgment, that the prison wasn't built by others, it was built by your assumptions of others, and those assumptions, once questioned, begin to fall apart. You start to notice how often you judge yourself more harshly than anyone else. You start to see that even when people do notice you, their judgment often reflects their own projections, not your truth. And most of all, you start to understand that the people worth being seen by, the ones who truly matter, aren't looking for perfect, they're looking for real. So what happens when you let go of the spotlight? When you walk into a room and stop performing, stop over-monitoring, stop shrinking under the false belief that everyone is watching. You breathe, you soften, you speak more freely, you laugh louder, you move with presence, you give yourself permission to be human. And in doing so, you give others permission too. Because vulnerability is contagious. Authenticity is magnetic. And when you stop believing you're being constantly judged, you stop judging others. You connect more deeply. You live more boldly. You return to yourself. There will always be moments when you feel exposed. When your heart races and your skin burns and your mind whispers, everyone saw that. But in those moments, remind yourself, they didn't. Or if they did, it wasn't with the scrutiny you imagined. And if they remember, it won't define you. Because you are not the moment you stumbled. You are not the awkward silence, the failed attempt, the misstep. You are the one who showed up, who tried, who stayed. And in the end, that's what people remember. Not your perfection, but your presence. You don't need to disappear to escape the spotlight. You just need to see it for what it is. A trick of the mind. A mirror reflecting your own fears more than anyone else's gaze. And once you see through it, the whole stage changes. You're not frozen under the lights anymore. You're moving, speaking, living, not for their applause, but for your own liberation. Not to be watched, but to be free. And that freedom, the kind that comes when you stop performing and start being, is the real light you've been searching for all along. You think they can see it on your face, the tension in your chest, the quiet frustration in your voice, the hurt in your eyes. You assume they know you're anxious, annoyed, uncomfortable, or overwhelmed. And when they don't respond the way you hope, when they don't ask if you're okay or acknowledge your pain, you start to question them. You think, how could they not know? But they don't. And just like you can't always read what others are feeling, they can't always read you either. This is the illusion of transparency. The belief that your internal emotional state is more visible to others than it actually is, and that theirs is just as readable to you. It's a subtle trick your mind plays, but its consequences run deep through miscommunication, unmet expectations, and emotional disconnection. Because you're so intimately aware of what you're feeling, you expect that awareness to leak out through body language, tone, or expression. You imagine your discomfort is written all over your face, that your silence speaks volumes, that your shift in energy is obvious, and maybe it is. To you, but to others, it often isn't. Because they're not inside your body, they're inside theirs. They're processing their own internal landscape. They're interpreting signals based on their own fears, assumptions, and stories. And unless you say it, unless you name your emotion, express it clearly, it often remains invisible no matter how loud it feels in your chest. The problem is that you don't just assume they can tell, you often assume they should. That if someone cares about you, they'll sense what's wrong, they'll understand, they'll notice. But caring doesn't grant mind-reading abilities, and when someone fails to pick up on your emotions, it doesn't necessarily mean they're insensitive or distant. It might mean your signals weren't as clear as you thought they were. You may feel like you were broadcasting pain, but they were receiving static. You think you whispered, "I'm not okay," with your eyes, but to them you looked fine. And when they don't respond the way you hoped, resentment quietly builds. Not because of what they did, but because of what you expected without ever articulating. The illusion works in the other direction too. You think you can read someone's vibe, interpret their silence, decode their facial expression. You assume you know why they're being distant, why their tone was off, why they didn't laugh at your joke, and so you start creating stories. They're mad at me, they're judging me, they don't like me anymore. But most of the time your interpretations are wrong or incomplete. Maybe they're tired, maybe they're distracted, maybe they're going through something unrelated to you. But you don't ask, you assume. And that assumption becomes a lens. You filter the rest of the interaction through it, often confirming what was never true in the first place. This is how disconnection happens. Not through cruelty or betrayal, but through misunderstood silences. Through feelings that were never expressed and assumptions that were never checked. You believe your emotions are obvious, and when they're not acknowledged, you feel invalidated. You believe you understand someone else's inner world, and when they don't match your expectations, you feel confused or betrayed. It's not a failure of love, it's a failure of clarity, a misalignment between what's felt and what's seen, between what's real and what's assumed. You might hesitate to express yourself because it feels vulnerable, because you believe saying "I'm hurt" or "I feel disconnected" makes you look weak or needy. So you hope they'll just know. You drop hints. You sigh. You grow quiet. You wait. But subtlety is not the same as communication. And your unspoken feelings, no matter how strong, are not guarantees of being understood. Clarity requires courage, the willingness to speak your truth even when it feels obvious. Because obvious to you doesn't mean obvious to them. This illusion also plays tricks in conflict. You believe the other person should know how much their words affected you. You believe your tone made it clear that you were joking or serious or hurt, and when they react differently, you blame them for misreading you. But communication isn't just about intention, it's about reception. If they didn't hear what you meant, if they didn't feel what you felt, then the message didn't land. And that's not always their fault, it's just how human connection works. Messy, incomplete, in need of repetition, clarification, patience. When you break through the illusion of transparency, you begin to realize how much of your emotional life lives in your own head. Not because others don't care, but because they can't see what you don't show. They can't understand what you don't say. They can't validate what you keep hidden. And the same goes for you. You don't see what others don't reveal. You don't hear the pain behind their silence unless they trust you enough to speak. You don't understand their story unless you ask. And in that mutual blindness is where so much hurt accumulates. But here's where the power lies. When you understand the illusion, you gain the ability to break it. You stop assuming and start asking. You stop hinting and start sharing. You bring your truth into the light, not for attention or pity, but for connection. You say, "I thought this was obvious, but maybe it wasn't." You say, "I don't want to assume, so can I ask what you're feeling?" And in that moment, walls fall. Not because someone finally guessed your truth, but because you were brave enough to tell it. So the next time you feel unseen, misunderstood, or disconnected, pause. Ask yourself, have I made this clear? Or am I assuming they should just know? And the next time you think you know what someone else is feeling, ask them. Invite their truth instead of projecting yours. Because in a world full of assumptions, the ones who are willing to check in with themselves, with others, are the ones who build real intimacy. Real understanding, real peace. You're not invisible, and neither are they. But between you stands an illusion. one that only dissolves when both of you choose honesty over guessing, clarity over comfort, expression over expectation, and in that space you no longer need to be read, you get to be known. You think you're weighing the facts, looking at the whole picture, making a balanced decision. But what if I told you that your very first exposure to something, an idea, a number, a person, even a feeling, quietly sets the tone for everything that follows? Long after you've moved on, that initial impression is still pulling the strings, shaping what feels reasonable, influencing what you compare things to, and warping what you think is fair. This is the anchoring trap, a psychological illusion so quiet, so automatic, that most people have no idea it's ruling their judgments. But it is. It hijacks how you estimate, how you evaluate, how you predict, and unless you learn to see it, it will lead you to mistake distortion for discernment. The moment your mind receives a piece of information, whether it's the price of a product, the salary for a job, or the first thing someone tells you about another person, it uses that information as a reference point. That anchor doesn't just sit there. It becomes the standard, the lens, the default. Everything that comes afterward gets filtered through it. If the first price you see for a car is $40,000, 0 cents, a $35,000, 0 cents, option suddenly feels like a deal, even if it's objectively overpriced. If you meet someone and the first thing you're told is that they're difficult, you'll begin scanning for signs of defensiveness or arrogance, even if what you're really seeing is someone cautious or shy. The anchor primes your attention. It doesn't reflect truth, it creates expectation. This isn't just a quirk, it's a built-in feature of how your brain conserves energy. Your mind doesn't start from scratch every time, it takes the first thing it sees and builds from there. Which means if the first thing is wrong, everything built on top of it leans off-center. This happens in negotiations, where the first number thrown out often sets the entire range of what feels acceptable. It happens in relationships, where first impressions color everything you learn later. It happens in decisions, where your initial guess makes you underestimate or overestimate, even in the face of new information. You think you're adjusting, but you're adjusting from a false foundation. And here's the dangerous part. You rarely realize it's happening. Anchors don't feel like manipulation. They feel like context. They feel like the starting point, but they're actually traps, mental shortcuts that bias your judgment and quietly limit your range of possibility. And the more emotionally charged the anchor is, the harder it is to escape. A bad first date makes you underestimate someone's depth. A negative headline about a country shapes your opinion about its entire culture. A single mistake from a colleague becomes the story you keep telling yourself about who they are. And even when new evidence appears, the anchor doesn't leave. It lingers, it whispers, it keeps you tethered to an outdated frame. You might think, I'm logical, I can override this. But studies have shown that even trained judges, doctors, and financial experts fall into the anchoring trap. In one famous experiment, participants were asked whether the Mississippi River was longer or shorter than 500 miles. Then they were asked to estimate the actual length. Their guesses were far lower than those who were first given a comparison of 5,000 miles. The anchor, no matter how arbitrary, reshaped their sense of what was reasonable. And that's what makes this illusion so deceptive. It's not just about what you think, it's about what feels plausible. And anchors don't just shape your thinking, they shape your sense of reality. Think about how this affects your self-worth. If the first messages you received growing up were that you weren't enough, weren't smart, weren't worthy, those became your anchors. Even when you achieve something great, that voice still compares it to the old standard. You tell yourself, it's not that impressive, or I just got lucky, because the anchor of inadequacy still sets the tone. Or maybe your anchor is comparison, what someone else has, what someone else achieved. And no matter what you do, it never feels like enough, because you're measuring your life against a distorted reference point. The anchoring trap doesn't just influence how you judge others, it influences how you judge yourself. And until you consciously reset your anchors, Until you examine the first assumptions you've made and ask if they're even valid, you'll keep building your life around invisible weights. You'll keep discounting new information because it doesn't align with your starting point. You'll keep assuming that the first impression was reality instead of realizing it was just the first frame of a much bigger picture. So how do you break free? You start by questioning your first reactions. When something feels too high, too low, too risky, too safe, ask, compared to what? Is that what based in truth or in the first number, label, or belief that came your way? You pause before deciding and ask yourself where your standards came from. Who set them? When did you first learn that this is what's normal or reasonable or deserved? And most importantly, you allow yourself to revise, to re-anchor, to say maybe I've been judging this person, this situation, or myself based on a distorted first impression. What if I looked again? Because the truth is your first thought isn't always your clearest. Sometimes it's your most conditioned, your most fearful, your most inherited. But once you become aware of that, you're no longer stuck. You can look past the first number. You can question the old narrative. You can give people, ideas, and yourself the grace of a second look. Not to be naive, but to be free. Anchors lose their power when you stop mistaking them for reality. They stop steering your life when you stop letting them decide what's possible. And in that awareness you reclaim the power to choose, not from a place of assumption, but from a place of presence. Not from where you started, but from who you are now. You've already given so much time, energy, emotion, years you can't get back. You've endured, you've fought, you've poured yourself into something that once seemed worth it. So walking away now feels like betrayal of your effort, of your story, of your own endurance. You think, if I quit now, it will all have been for nothing. That's the trap. That's the sunk cost fallacy whispering in your ear. It tells you that what you've already spent, whether it's years in a relationship, money on a failing business, or emotional investment in a belief system, should determine what you do next. But the truth is, what's gone is gone. The time you spent won't return. The love you gave won't refill your cup. The sacrifices you made won't suddenly make something right just because you keep choosing it. And yet, your mind convinces you to stay, not because it's still serving you, but because it once did. This fallacy lives in the fear of waste. It feeds on the idea that quitting is failure, that change means admitting you were wrong. And for many, that feels unbearable. So you double down, you try harder, you stay longer. You keep telling yourself that maybe, just maybe, if you endure a little more, it will turn around. That the job will start fulfilling you, that the relationship will suddenly align, that the belief will start making sense again. You keep investing in something that isn't working, not because it's right, but because of how much it already cost. But here's the brutal truth. No amount of past investment can justify staying stuck in something that drains you. That's not loyalty, it's self-abandonment disguised as perseverance. You don't owe your future to your past. You don't owe more of your life to something that has already taken too much. And yet, the deeper the investment, the stronger the illusion becomes. You believe you're being strong by holding on, when real strength might mean letting go. This isn't just about big life choices, it happens in everyday decisions too. You watch a movie you're not enjoying, but you sit through the last hour because you already started it. You stay at an event that's draining you because you made the effort to come. You continue down a path because you already bought the ticket. Your brain weighs what's already been spent and uses that weight to make decisions about the present. But that weight is irrelevant. It doesn't exist anymore. It's sunk. The only thing that matters now is whether continuing serves your well-being, your truth, your growth. You've been conditioned to believe that persistence is noble, that finishing what you started makes you strong, and sometimes it does, but not when it's killing your spirit, not when it's eating away at your peace, not when it's costing you more than it's giving. There's a difference between grit and entrapment, between perseverance and denial, and the sunk cost fallacy thrives in that blurred space between the two. convincing you that giving more will somehow redeem what's already been lost. You might say, "But I've already sacrificed so much I can't stop now," but the deeper question is, should you have had to sacrifice that much in the first place? What if the amount you've given is actually a sign that it was never aligned? What if the effort you've made is proof not of value but of imbalance? You've given your time, yes, but time given to the wrong thing doesn't suddenly make it right. That's the painful realization most people avoid, because it means admitting that some part of you knew and didn't want to face it. But facing it isn't failure. It's freedom. It's the moment you say, just because I've been walking in the wrong direction doesn't mean I have to keep going. It's the courage to stop, not because you're weak, but because you're finally ready to stop bleeding for something that won't heal you. You stop expecting return on an emotional investment that was never meant to pay off in the way you hoped. And in that moment you reclaim something powerful, your right to pivot. This fallacy also shows up in your inner beliefs. You may hold on to certain worldviews or ideologies not because they resonate now, but because they once shaped your identity. Letting go of them would feel like erasing who you used to be. But growth isn't erasure, it's expansion. It means you outgrew the frame. You evolved past the container. You learned something that changed you. And that's not betrayal. That's evolution. And no belief is worth holding on to if it demands you stay small just to remain consistent. There's grief in letting go, of course there is. You're not just walking away from a job or a person or a dream. You're walking away from the version of yourself who believed in it. And that version deserves to be honored, not resented. They did what they knew. They hoped, they tried, they showed up. But now it's your job to protect who you've become. And that means making decisions based on what is, not what was. That means saying, I loved it once, I fought for it once, but it no longer fits the truth of who I am. And that's okay. Because what you've given isn't wasted. It became part of your becoming. It shaped your discernment. It taught you what to look for next time. But it doesn't obligate you to keep going. You don't have to chase redemption. You don't have to keep feeding a fire that only burns you. You can stop. You can turn around. You can say, that was then, this is now. The sunk cost fallacy loses its power when you realize your future deserves more than a decision based on your past. You are not what you've invested in. You are who you choose to become now. And the moment you choose freedom over justification, that's the moment you become unstoppable. You don't see the world as it is, you see it as you expect it to be. Your beliefs aren't passive ideas floating in your mind, they're filters, lenses, magnets. And once you hold a belief about yourself, about others, about reality, your brain starts scanning for anything that confirms it. It selects facts that align, ignores data that doesn't, and twists ambiguity into agreement. This is confirmation bias, one of the most powerful illusions your mind creates. And unless you confront it, it will quietly imprison you in a reality of your own construction, one that feels accurate but is anything but whole. The moment you adopt a belief, whether it's political, personal, spiritual, or even trivial, your mind goes to work reinforcing it. Like a lawyer trying to build a case rather than a judge trying to find the truth, your subconscious looks for evidence that supports your position and dismisses what contradicts it. If you believe you're not good enough, you'll replay every failure and overlook every moment of strength. If you think the world is hostile, you'll focus on aggression and miss the quiet acts of kindness happening all around you. If you think someone is out to get you, every neutral action becomes suspect. You start connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. The bias doesn't just shape your perceptions, it builds your reality. And here's the twist. The more convinced you are of your belief, the less likely you are to notice that you're filtering at all. The more obvious something seems, the more likely it is that you've stopped questioning it. Because confirmation bias doesn't feel like bias. It feels like clarity, like common sense, like truth. But it's not truth. It's a carefully curated illusion, maintained by your brain to protect your sense of certainty. Because certainty to the brain feels like safety. Uncertainty? That's threatening. That's vulnerable. So your mind avoids it by reinforcing whatever narrative you already live inside. Social media, algorithms, and echo chambers make this even more dangerous. You're not just seeing the world through your bias. You're surrounded by systems that feed it. Platforms show you what you already agree with. Headlines confirm what you already fear. Groups of people validate what you already believe. And so, without realizing it, you start mistaking consensus for accuracy. You think, everyone I know sees it this way, forgetting that your digital world is curated to reflect you. It becomes a hall of mirrors, each one reinforcing the last. And in that reflection, your beliefs harden. They stop evolving, they stop breathing. But this doesn't just impact how you see the world, it deeply affects how you see yourself. If you believe you're unlovable, you'll ignore compliments, question kindness, and amplify criticism. If you believe you're always the one to blame, you'll take on guilt even when it doesn't belong to you. Your identity becomes shaped not by reality but by the fragments of it your mind has chosen to highlight. And what you think is self-awareness is often just a loop of old beliefs playing back as proof. This bias also poisons communication. When you're locked into a belief about someone, especially in conflict, you'll misinterpret everything they say. A neutral tone sounds passive-aggressive. A simple question feels like an accusation. You assume intention. You read between lines that don't exist. And the more emotional the topic, the more distorted the perception. You don't listen to understand. You listen to confirm. You wait for them to say the thing you already believe they mean, and when they do, whether they actually did or not, you feel vindicated. But what you've really done is recreated them in your image of them, not who they truly are. So how do you break this spell? You start by recognizing that your mind is not neutral. It doesn't observe, it selects. And that means you can't trust every thought just because it feels right. You have to practice intellectual humility, the willingness to say, I could be wrong, the discipline to seek out what contradicts you, not just what comforts you, to ask, what am I not seeing instead of how can I be more right? It means becoming a student again, listening not to win but to learn. You also learn to hold your beliefs instead of being held by them, to loosen your grip, to ask yourself, when did I start believing this? Who did I hear it from? What if it's only half true? What if it used to be true but no longer is? These questions don't make you weak, they make you wise. Because real strength isn't in rigid certainty, it's in flexible awareness, in the ability to revise your beliefs when new information emerges. And you apply the same grace to others. You stop assuming that just because someone disagrees, they're wrong, or stupid, or blind. You ask what shaped their views, what experiences led them there, and even if you still disagree, you do it from understanding, not superiority. Because the moment you assume you're the only one seeing clearly, you've already fallen deeper into the trap. Confirmation bias will always exist. It's part of how the human mind copes with the overwhelming complexity of life. But when you become aware of it, you're no longer enslaved by it. You start to catch the moments when your mind is distorting, when your beliefs are filtering, when your certainty is actually fear in disguise. And in those moments, you breathe, you pause, you step back, and you choose curiosity over conviction. Because the truth is, your beliefs are not sacred, your growth is. And growth only happens when you're willing to challenge what you've always assumed, when you stop worshipping your opinions and start refining your awareness. That's where clarity lives, not in the echo, but in the silence that follows when the echo fades. Not in what you already believe, but in what you're brave enough to question. It's a strange truth of human nature. Those who know the least often speak with the most confidence. They stride into conversations with unshakable certainty, making bold claims, offering black and white opinions, and rarely second-guessing themselves. Meanwhile, those who've studied deeply, reflected thoroughly, and seen the complexities of a topic tend to speak more cautiously. They hedge their words. They admit what they don't know. They ask more than they assert. At first glance it seems backward, but it's not. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect in action, the cognitive illusion where the less you know about a subject, the more confident you feel in your knowledge, and the more you actually know, the more aware you become of your limitations. This happens because ignorance isn't just a lack of knowledge, it's also a lack of awareness about that lack. In other words, when you don't know enough about something, you also don't know what you don't know. There's no map in your mind showing the blind spots. You mistake the small bit of information you do have as the whole truth, and in doing so you overestimate your competence. You speak as if you've seen the full landscape when you've only stood at the edge. This illusion of mastery feels empowering, but it's built on a fragile foundation, one that crumbles the moment it's exposed to real depth. The more you learn, the more your perspective shifts. You start to see nuances. You recognize contradictions. You become aware of exceptions to the rules. You realize that the deeper truths don't fit into sound bites or slogans. And that awareness, ironically, can make you feel less confident, not more. You understand that certainty is a luxury of the uninformed, and so you begin to qualify your statements. You say things like "it depends" or "I could be wrong," not because you're unsure, but because you respect the complexity. But from the outside, this humility can be mistaken for weakness. People hear it and assume you don't really know. Meanwhile, those who are loudest, those shouting the clearest answers with no room for doubt, are often the ones standing on the shallowest ground. This creates a dangerous imbalance in the world. The most informed voices get drowned out by the most confident ones. Public discourse becomes dominated by people who don't realize how little they understand. And those who do understand step back, overwhelmed by the noise or unwilling to engage in debate with people who don't recognize the depth of the subject. As a result, policies get shaped by oversimplification. Movements get fueled by emotion rather than insight. Conversations collapse into arguments where volume trumps wisdom and certainty masquerades as truth. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just affect how we see others. It affects how we see ourselves. You may have noticed it in your own life. You read one article, watch one video, hear one perspective, and suddenly feel like you've got a solid grasp on something. You start explaining it to others, convinced of your clarity. But then you dive deeper. You read more, explore further, hear conflicting views, and slowly that clarity dissolves. What once seemed simple now seems layered. What once felt obvious now feels delicate. You don't become dumber, you become aware. And that awareness brings humility, sometimes even doubt. But that's not regression, that's growth. This is why true intelligence doesn't shout, it listens. It asks questions, it adjusts, it understands that knowledge is not a destination but a process, and that no matter how much you know, there's always more you don't. The wisest people you'll ever meet aren't the ones with all the answers. They're the ones who are comfortable not having all the answers, who don't need to dominate a room to prove their worth, who can say, "I don't know," with grace, because their identity isn't tied to appearing right. It's tied to seeking truth. You may also notice this effect in your relationships. Someone speaks with unwavering confidence about your intentions, your choices, or your character, even though they've never lived your life. Their certainty is unsettling, but it makes sense when you realize they're not speaking from deep understanding, they're speaking from projection, from assumption. And unless they actually know you, the more room they have to imagine a version of you that fits their story. The more they learn, the more that certainty often softens. It's replaced by empathy, by curiosity, by the recognition that every person contains contradictions that don't fit into easy narratives. The Dunning-Kruger trap also shows up in leadership. In workplaces, those who speak the loudest or seem the most self-assured often rise faster, not because they're more competent, but because they project competence. And unless there's a culture that values reflection over bravado, it's easy for teams, even entire organizations, to follow the wrong voices, to mistake confidence for capability. But real leadership requires the opposite. It requires the humility to listen, the strength to say, I'm not sure, but let's find out. The wisdom to include perspectives you don't yet understand. So how do you protect yourself from this illusion? First, by staying in a constant state of learning, by remembering that the moment something feels too simple, too obvious, too one-dimensional, it probably isn't. You question your confidence. You stay open. You say, maybe I haven't seen the whole picture yet. And that doesn't make you less wise. It makes you more conscious. You also learn to distinguish between the feeling of certainty and the reality of truth. Just because something feels right doesn't mean it is right. Feelings are not facts, and conviction is not the same as accuracy. Second, you surround yourself with people who challenge you, who aren't afraid to say, have you thought about this another way? You don't look for echo chambers, you look for truth tellers. You invite perspectives that disrupt your comfort zone, because that's where real insight begins. And you do the same for others, not to shame them, but to invite them deeper. You say, that's interesting, what led you to believe that? And through conversation, not confrontation, you help each other grow. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not a flaw to be ashamed of. It's a universal pattern to be aware of. We all start in that place of overconfidence. We all move through the valley of doubt. And if we keep going, we arrive at something deeper than certainty. We arrive at wisdom, a quiet, steady knowing that doesn't need to prove itself, a knowing that respects complexity, that leads with questions, that understands that the more we learn, the more we realize how much we haven't even begun to touch. And that, ironically, is when you truly begin to understand. You walk through the world carrying your beliefs, your values, your preferences, your opinions, and without realizing it, you start to assume that most people probably see things the way you do, that they share your moral compass, your sense of right and wrong, your gut reactions to situations. You imagine that your way of thinking is normal, that it's shared, that it's somehow the default. And when someone behaves differently, when they believe something that contradicts what feels obvious to you, you're shocked, confused, maybe even angry. You think, how could they not see it? But what you're really facing isn't just a disagreement, it's the collapse of a subtle illusion your brain has been maintaining all along. It's called the false consensus effect, and it's one of the most powerful ways we misunderstand not just others, but ourselves. This illusion convinces you that your perspective is not only valid but widely shared. You assume others think like you, because it feels natural to project your mind onto the world. After all, your thoughts aren't foreign to you. They're familiar, logical, emotionally aligned. They make sense from the inside, so you start to believe they must make sense from the outside too. But the truth is, most people are operating from an entirely different internal map. Their upbringing, their traumas, their beliefs, their fears. It's a unique configuration that shapes how they interpret everything. And that configuration isn't wrong, it's just different. But when you forget that, you start assuming your reality is the reality. This creates all kinds of friction. You assume your sense of humor is universal, until someone doesn't laugh. You assume your political stance is common sense until someone passionately disagrees. You assume your values are the baseline for decency until someone makes a choice that violates them. And when those moments happen, they don't just challenge your views, they challenge your assumption that you're in sync with the majority, that your worldview is shared, that the mental world you inhabit is the one most people live in. And when that illusion breaks, it doesn't just confuse you, it can isolate you. This is why disagreement can feel so personal, even when it isn't. It's not just that someone has a different opinion, it's that their opinion reveals a deeper truth. They don't share your lens. And that can feel threatening. Because if someone doesn't see what you see, then maybe your view isn't as universal as you thought. Maybe it's just one among many. Maybe it's shaped more by your story than by some objective truth. And that possibility can be deeply unsettling, so instead of embracing the difference, you push back, you try to convince, you try to bring them into your world. Because if they agree, then you feel safe again, like the consensus still exists. But the consensus was never real, it was always a projection. And the more you believe in it, the more surprised and frustrated you become when others don't conform to it. This doesn't just happen on an individual level. It happens in communities, in politics, in social movements. People surround themselves with others who think similarly and then mistake that curated circle for the world. They believe everyone agrees, not realizing they've built an echo chamber. And when that chamber is pierced by an election result, a protest, a divergent viewpoint, it feels like the world has gone mad. But really, it's just the world revealing itself for what it's always been: diverse, complex, inherently fragmented. This illusion also keeps you from truly listening. When you assume others think like you stop asking questions. You stop being curious. You fill in blanks with your own logic instead of seeking to understand theirs. You nod along in conversations, assuming agreement where there may be none. And you miss chances to connect more deeply, because you're projecting instead of perceiving. The danger here isn't just miscommunication, it's disconnection. You build relationships on assumed understanding only to be blindsided later when those assumptions prove false, and then you feel betrayed not because someone changed, but because they never shared your view to begin with. The false consensus effect doesn't just limit your understanding of others, it limits your growth. When you assume you're already aligned with most people, you stop challenging your own ideas. You stop evolving. You don't feel the need to step outside your perspective, because you've mistaken it for the collective perspective. But growth only happens when you realize that your beliefs aren't universal, that your truths aren't absolute, that the world is full of intelligent, thoughtful people who see things very differently, and not because they're wrong, but because their lenses are different. Their truth is filtered through another path, another pain, another purpose. So how do you step outside this illusion? You start by acknowledging that your mind is not the center of the universe, that your thoughts are not facts, that your moral instincts, no matter how deeply felt, are still shaped by conditioning. You begin to listen without the goal of changing someone's mind. You ask not, why don't they agree with me, but what shaped their view, and you stay open even when it's uncomfortable, because truth doesn't live in agreement, it lives in understanding. And understanding requires humility. You also begin to diversify your inputs, read things you wouldn't normally read, spend time with people outside your usual circles, ask questions that don't lead back to you. The more perspectives you're exposed to, the more your own assumptions begin to soften. You start to see your view not as the correct one, but as one possible lens in a kaleidoscope of human experience. And from that place, compassion grows. Not just for others, but for yourself, because you realize that even when you disagree, you're still connected, not by sameness, but by the shared effort to make sense of this life. The world isn't supposed to agree with you. That was never the point. The point is to learn how to see without projecting, how to love without controlling, how to be confident in your view while remaining open to the mystery of others. When you let go of the illusion of consensus, you stop trying to get everyone to think like you, and you stop seeing them for who they really are. And in that shift, connection becomes possible. Not because you share a worldview, but because you share the courage to be real in a world full of assumptions. Your mind doesn't calculate reality with precision, it takes shortcuts. And one of the most deceptive shortcuts it uses is this: if something is easy to recall, it must be important, it must be common, it must be true. This is the availability heuristic, a mental bias that convinces you the most vivid, emotionally charged, or frequently repeated information is the most accurate reflection of how the world really works. But in truth, what's easiest to remember is rarely what's most representative. It's what's been repeated, dramatized, or emotionally seared into your mind. And that means your picture of reality might be more about what stands out than what actually is. When you watch the news and see story after story about violent crime, you start to feel like danger is everywhere. Your neighborhood feels less safe, strangers feel more threatening, you lock your doors a little earlier, but statistically crime rates may have gone down. It doesn't matter, because your perception isn't shaped by data, it's shaped by memory. And violent stories are easy to remember. They're emotional, they stick, and the easier something is to recall, the more your brain assumes it reflects reality. So you overestimate the frequency. You think this happens all the time, even when it doesn't. You fear the wrong things. You miss the quiet truths hidden beneath the noise. This heuristic isn't just triggered by media. It shows up in your everyday thoughts. If you've heard a story of someone dying from a plane crash recently, your fear of flying spikes, even though air travel is still statistically safer than driving. If you remember a time you failed publicly, you hesitate to take risks again, not because you're likely to fail, but because that one vivid memory is louder than all the quiet successes you've forgotten. You might even judge your day based on the most emotionally charged moment, forgetting all the neutral or good ones. One argument overshadows 10 peaceful hours. One criticism outweighs a dozen compliments. Your brain picks what's emotionally sticky and uses it to shape your entire conclusion. The availability heuristic fools you into believing that your memories are a fair sample size, that what stands out in your mind is a trustworthy indicator of how things usually go. But memory is biased. It's skewed by repetition, emotion, and recency. If something happened recently, you overestimate its frequency. If something was painful, you overestimate its likelihood. And if something was shocking, you overestimate its impact. Your mind takes that accessible thought and lets it dominate your judgment, even when it's the exception, not the rule. This illusion becomes especially dangerous when it shapes your self-perception. You remember the time you said the wrong thing, not the times you spoke beautifully. You remember when someone ignored you, not when they smiled. You remember being rejected, not all the ways you've been loved. And those memories, because they're vivid and painful, become your internal proof. You tell yourself, this is who I am, based not on the totality of your experience, but on a few sharp moments that echo louder than the rest. You don't mean to distort yourself, it just happens when you believe that what's most memorable must be what's most true. In relationships, this bias creates tension. You remember the fights, the betrayals, the moments of pain, but forget the subtle, quiet gestures of care. You fixate on the wound, not the healing. And when you argue, you draw on a few charged examples that support your emotion, ignoring the larger pattern. You say, you always do this, or you never do that, not because it's true, but because the moments that prove your point are the ones your brain retrieves first. They're available, but they aren't the whole story. The same thing happens when you think about other people's intentions. You remember that one time someone let you down, and it colors every future interaction. You remember a single betrayal and use it to justify mistrust, even when others have been kind, generous, consistent. Your brain clings to what's easy to recall and builds stories around it, and those stories shape how you show up. Cautious, guarded, expecting hurt, not because people are always harmful, but because your memory of harm is louder than your memory of connection. And then there's your perception of the world. You believe the economy is collapsing because you've seen 5 headlines about layoffs. You believe the world is getting more violent because you saw a viral video. You believe your country is falling apart because a few social media posts got under your skin. But headlines are curated for attention, not balance. And your emotional reaction isn't always a reflection of global truth. It's a reflection of what your brain grabbed first, and what it grabbed was loud, not complete. So how do you break free from this illusion? First, you recognize that memory is not a mirror, it's a spotlight. It illuminates what's vivid, not what's common. And that means you must pause before drawing conclusions. Ask yourself, is this really how things usually are? Or is it just what I remember most easily? When you feel afraid, ask, is this fear based on probability or just a strong memory? When you feel certain, ask, is this truth or just something I've heard over and over again? These small questions begin to widen your lens. You can also train your mind to see more clearly by consciously seeking counter-evidence. For every painful memory, recall 2 moments of joy or growth. For every frightening headline, look at the broader statistics. For every judgment about yourself, dig up moments that contradict it. You start building a more balanced archive, not one that denies pain, but one that doesn't let pain define the whole narrative. And over time you start to shift. Your memory becomes more layered, your judgment more accurate, your emotions more aligned with reality. The availability heuristic will always be there, trying to whisper shortcuts in your ear, but now you know better. You know that what comes to mind first isn't always what matters most, that what's loudest in your memory isn't necessarily what's truest in your life. And with that awareness, you begin to reclaim your perception, not from what's most available, but from what's most real. Your heart races, your palms sweat. There's a buzz running through your chest, a sense of urgency, of something rising. But you don't quite know why, so your mind searches for an explanation, and whatever it lands on you believe. You decide you're in love, or you decide you're afraid. You think you're angry, or you think you're inspired. But the sensation started in your body, not in your thoughts. That spark, that pulse, that physiological arousal was just a raw signal, and your brain, always trying to make sense of the chaos, attaches meaning to it. This is the misattribution of arousal, the illusion that the emotion you're feeling matches the truth of what's happening, when in fact, it's just one possible interpretation of a biological sensation. The body and the mind are in constant dialogue, but that dialogue isn't always precise. Your body reacts first. Something happens. Loud noise, flashing light, physical exertion, even caffeine, and your system floods with energy. Adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine, your heartbeat quickens, your breath changes, your muscles tense. You're alert, aroused, activated, but arousal isn't an emotion, it's a state. And it's neutral until your brain labels it. If you're on a first date and your heart is pounding, you might think this is chemistry. If you're giving a speech, you might say, I'm terrified. If you're in a heated argument, you may conclude, I'm furious. But in each case, your body is just activated, and your interpretation is what turns it into a feeling. This is how you can confuse fear for love, or anxiety for intuition. Because your brain isn't always accurate, it's efficient. It uses context and assumption to explain what you're feeling, and once it decides, it rarely questions itself. If your heart is racing while talking to someone new, your mind might say, I'm attracted to them, when maybe you're just nervous, or cold, or overstimulated. If you're feeling elevated after a near miss in traffic, you might mistake that adrenaline rush for rage, or even a strange euphoria. The same internal sensation, racing pulse, shallow breath, heightened awareness, can be interpreted as excitement, fear, passion, or dread. It's not the body that decides, it's the label you give it. And once that label locks in, it guides your behavior. You act on it. You pursue the crush, assuming the chemistry is real. You lash out in anger, believing your interpretation is justified. You retreat from an opportunity, mistaking butterflies for danger, and all the while you never realize that the emotion you felt was not truth. It was a guess. A mental shortcut based on an ancient survival mechanism that equates body sensation with meaning. But meaning isn't fixed, it's assigned, and that means your emotions can lie, not maliciously, but reflexively. This illusion becomes especially powerful in moments of stress or uncertainty. When you don't know what to feel, your brain rushes in with answers. You walk across a high bridge and meet someone at the other side. Your arousal is high, so you feel more drawn to them. Studies have proven this. People often rate strangers as more attractive when they meet them during physically arousing situations like crossing a rope bridge, because their mind misattributes the physiological tension as romantic attraction. It feels real, but it's not romance. It's biology in disguise. The same principle applies to fear. Sometimes what you call fear is just energy, a readiness, a signal that something matters. But if you label that arousal as danger, you shrink, you flee, you avoid the thing that might have expanded you. Other times you may think you're angry when you're really just overstimulated, or that you're in love when what you're feeling is simply relief or hope or admiration. Emotion is messy, And your body's signals don't always match the truth, they match your interpretation. And that means your emotional compass can lead you off course if you don't know how to read it. The misattribution of arousal also shows up in conflict. Your body becomes activated. Maybe you're hungry, maybe you're tired, maybe you've been holding tension all day. Then someone says something triggering, not because it's cruel, but because your body is primed to respond. You snap, you blame them, you say things you don't mean. But what really happened was that your physiological state was waiting for a story, and the conversation gave it one. You weren't just reacting to words, you were reacting to a misread of your own body. And that's how relationships suffer, not because people don't care, but because they don't know how to distinguish signal from story. This illusion also affects your memory. You'll look back at moments of intensity and assign meaning based on what you felt physically, even if your interpretation at the time was flawed. You'll say, "I knew I was right," because you remember how strong the emotion was. But strength of emotion doesn't equal accuracy of perception. Your body isn't a lie detector. It's a resonance chamber. It reacts, but what it reacts to isn't always what you think. So how do you break free? You start by separating sensation from story. When your body activates, pause before naming it. Ask yourself, what am I actually feeling? Is this tension from this moment? Or from earlier today? Is this excitement? Or is it fear disguised as possibility? Is this attraction? Or just arousal misinterpreted in a charged situation? You check in with your breath, your posture, your environment. You question your immediate interpretations, not to deny your feelings, but to clarify them. Because clarity doesn't come from believing every thought. It comes from observing every sensation with openness. And you learn to hold your emotions lightly, to recognize that feelings are information, not instruction. That just because something feels urgent doesn't mean it's true. That just because your body is activated doesn't mean your interpretation is correct. You create space between stimulus and story, and in that space you gain freedom. Freedom to choose your response. Freedom to reinterpret the signal. Freedom to say, "This might not be what I think it is. Let me look again." Your body speaks in impulses. Your mind translates. But translation isn't always truth. It's an approximation, and the more aware you become of that, the more grounded your emotional world becomes. You stop being ruled by misinterpretation. You stop chasing illusions, and instead you begin to feel what's actually here, not what your mind guessed in a moment of arousal, but what your soul knows in stillness. That's the beginning of emotional mastery. Not control, but clarity. Not repression, but realignment. You think you're making a rational choice. You compare two options, weigh the pros and cons, and go with what feels like the better deal. It seems logical, clean, conscious, but there's a subtle manipulation happening beneath the surface, one that you rarely notice. You're not just choosing between two things. You're being nudged by a third, a decoy, an irrelevant or inferior option placed in front of you not to be chosen, but to make one of the other two look more attractive by comparison. This is the decoy effect. It hijacks your decision-making by exploiting your tendency to compare, to anchor, to look for patterns of advantage, even when they don't actually serve your goals. Imagine you walk into a coffee shop. The menu shows a small for $3.00, a medium for $4.50, and a large for $5.00. Most people would pause, thinking whether the large is worth the slight bump in price. But now, imagine a new option appears, a medium for $4.75. Suddenly that $5.00 large looks like a steal. Why? Because your brain doesn't assess value in a vacuum, it compares, and the moment an option is introduced that's clearly worse than another, that better one suddenly feels like the smart, obvious, even rewarding choice. You weren't drawn to the large at first, but once the decoy appeared, it created contrast. It framed the large as not just bigger, but better value. Your decision now feels empowered, but it was engineered. This doesn't just happen with coffee, it happens with almost every commercial choice you make. Subscriptions, tech gadgets, insurance plans, even vacation packages. Companies insert decoy options that are designed to be rejected but strategically shape your perception. If option A is small and cheap and option B is big and expensive, you might hesitate. But introduce option C, almost as expensive as B but with fewer features, and suddenly B feels like a win. Nothing about B changed, only the framing did, and your brain, wired to seek contrast and avoid loss, walks right into the illusion. But the decoy effect doesn't stop at purchases. It shapes how you evaluate people, ideas, and opportunities. You meet someone new and they seem charming, especially after you've just dealt with someone cold or rude. The charm isn't absolute, it's relative. You feel more attracted not because of who they are, but because of who they followed. In job interviews, a strong candidate looks even stronger when placed next to someone clearly underqualified, not because they're objectively perfect, but because they're framed in contrast. And your mind, searching for clarity in complexity, clings to that contrast as evidence of superiority. You may not realize it, but you've been shaped by decoys in relationships too. You might choose a partner not because they're truly aligned with you, but because they look better than someone else who disappointed you. That someone else becomes the decoy, casting a shadow that makes the next person feel brighter. And the danger here is subtle. Because you think you're choosing with wisdom, with experience, but sometimes you're just reacting to comparison, to what came before, to the illusion of value, not the essence of connection. Even your opinions can be manipulated this way. When a radical or extreme idea is introduced, one you would never normally agree with, it can make a merely bad idea seem moderate. It's how public narratives are shifted. Introduce a decoy position so extreme it repels people, and the slightly less extreme position suddenly feels reasonable by contrast. You haven't become more open-minded, you've just been recalibrated by proximity. The Overton window shifts, your standards bend, and the new normal was never natural, it was framed. This illusion plays on a deeper vulnerability, the human need to avoid regret. You want to feel that your choice was justified, that you didn't miss out, that you optimized the opportunity. And when a decoy makes another option look clearly superior, your mind grabs it as insurance against uncertainty. You say, well, clearly this is better than that, and that logic silences your doubts. But it's a hollow logic, rooted not in true alignment or deep desire, but in manipulated contrast. You didn't choose what spoke to you. You chose what looked better than the decoy. So how do you defend yourself against this? First, by noticing when you're comparing. Ask yourself, would I want this if the other options weren't here? Strip away the context and see what remains. If the option still resonates, it might be genuine, but if its appeal dissolves without comparison, you're likely reacting to a frame, not a fact. This applies to choices in love, in work, in belief. If you only value something because it's better than a worse alternative, you're not seeing clearly. You're choosing through distortion. You also start examining what's being offered to you and why. Ask who benefits from each choice being on the table. If an option seems strangely inferior, it might not be a mistake. It might be a mirror, a tool, a psychological trap set to guide your gaze. Marketers use this. Politicians use this. Sometimes even friends and family use this unconsciously. And the more aware you become of this tactic, the less likely you are to be pulled by it. Real clarity doesn't come from having more options, it comes from knowing what you truly value. When you know what matters to you, no decoy can sway your course. You stop choosing based on comparison and start choosing based on alignment. Not what looks better than the other, but what resonates deeper within me. You no longer need to justify your choices with contrasts. You trust your inner compass more than the manufactured menu in front of you. Because the truth is, most of the decisions that shape your life aren't about the better deal. They're about the better fit. And the more you see through the illusions of framing, of contrast, of manipulation, the more power you reclaim over your path. You begin choosing not out of fear of making the wrong move, but from the wisdom of knowing what's truly yours. And that's where freedom lives, not in the illusion of choice, but in the clarity of knowing yourself beyond the decoy. You hear the stories everywhere, how someone dropped out of school and became a billionaire, how an unknown artist uploaded one video and became a global sensation, how someone followed their passion against all odds and it just worked out. These stories are intoxicating. They're repeated endlessly, turned into books, interviews, motivational reels. They suggest a seductive narrative that success is simply a matter of will, of belief, of hustle. And if you're not succeeding, maybe it's because you're not trying hard enough. Maybe you're missing some secret that the winners know. But what you don't see, the part left out of the spotlight, is the vast graveyard of those who tried just as hard, wanted it just as badly, and still didn't make it. This is the trap of survivorship bias. The illusion that success is more common, more replicable, and more in your control than it really is. Your brain naturally focuses on what's visible. It looks for patterns in what survived, who got the funding, who went viral, who broke through. But the moment you only look at the winners, your perception becomes distorted. You start to think, if they did it, I can too, not realizing that for every one person who succeeded, there were thousands, maybe millions, who didn't. Not because they were lazy or talentless, but because life is far more chaotic, more random, more structurally tilted than success stories ever reveal. And when you ignore that invisible majority, you start believing in a false map, one drawn by exceptions, not by the rule. This illusion is everywhere. In business, in art, in relationships, in health. You see a startup become a unicorn and think entrepreneurship is the answer, forgetting that 90% of startups fail within 5 years. You see a YouTuber hit 1 million subscribers and think consistency is the key, overlooking the sea of channels uploading daily for years with no traction. You see a couple post radiant anniversary photos and assume love is simple, not seeing the silent disintegration of the 100 couples who didn't post at all. You're drawn to what shines, but what shines is often what simply survived, not necessarily what was smartest, most deserving, or most sustainable. Survivorship bias doesn't just distort your expectations, it distorts your sense of self. Because when you fail to replicate what others have achieved, you don't just feel disappointed, you feel defective. You think, what's wrong with me? You internalize the illusion and turn it into shame. But you were never given the full picture. You didn't see the failures swept under the rug, the talent that went unnoticed, the timing that didn't align, the luck that went the other way. The truth is, most of what happens in life is complex, messy, influenced by factors you can't measure, let alone control. But the myth of meritocracy seduces you into believing it's all effort and mindset, that success is proof of worth, and failure, proof of weakness. This is dangerous, not just for your own mental health, but for how you treat others. Survivorship bias makes you less compassionate, less understanding. You start judging people by outcomes, not effort, by visibility, not depth. You think, if they really wanted it, they'd have made it work, forgetting that making it is often not a matter of want, but of circumstance. You forget the role of connections, timing, privilege, chance encounters. You turn the rare exception into the standard and hold everyone to it, including yourself. And slowly the world begins to feel unfair, but not because it is unfair, because your expectations were built on a distorted foundation. Even your understanding of history is shaped by this bias. You study the generals who won wars, the companies that survived depressions, the thinkers whose ideas endured, but you rarely hear about the equally brilliant minds who were silenced, the businesses that almost made it but folded at the last second, the revolutionaries who were crushed before they could write their names into textbooks. What survives becomes the story, what's lost is forgotten. But that lost knowledge might have mattered just as much, if not more. Your view of what's possible is shaped by the winners, but real wisdom requires you to learn from what didn't work too. This doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue your dreams. It doesn't mean success is impossible, but it does mean you need to see clearly, to hold space for reality, not fantasy, to honor effort even when it doesn't lead to applause. Because the truth is, effort itself is sacred, growth is sacred, the attempt is sacred, even when it ends in silence. Not every story needs a viral ending to be meaningful. Not every life needs a trophy to be worthy. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is keep going, even when the spotlight never finds you. So how do you protect yourself from this illusion? You start by questioning the stories. Not to reject them, but to see what's missing. When someone shares their journey, ask what did they have access to that others don't? What did they risk and what cushion did they fall back on? What version of their story are they telling and what version are they leaving out? You begin to study not just the paths that led to victory, but the ones that ended quietly. You read stories of failure, of quiet perseverance, of those who tried and didn't rise, but still lived with grace, with courage, with depth. Because those stories are real too. They just don't get published as often. And you recalibrate your metrics. You stop asking, did I make it? And start asking, did I show up fully? You stop measuring by outcomes and start measuring by integrity. Did you create from your truth? Did you speak honestly? Did you try with your whole heart even when no one was watching? That's what matters. That's what's real. Because while success may be rare, sincerity doesn't have to be, and a life built on that, on presence, on purpose, on truth, is never wasted, even if it doesn't survive the spotlight. You walk through life believing you know who you are. You wear a name, a role, a collection of memories and preferences, stories of your past, hopes for your future. You carry a personality that feels consistent. I'm introverted. I'm anxious. I'm ambitious. I'm broken. You define yourself by what you've done, what's been done to you, how others have labeled you, how you've labeled yourself. It feels real, solid, unchanging, but that identity, the one you defend, the one you explain to others, the one you silently rehearse, isn't who you really are. It's a construct, a mental collage built from fragments shaped by illusions, and unless you see through it, you'll live trapped in a version of yourself that was never truly yours. From the moment you were born, the world began assigning meaning to you. You're such a calm baby, they said. You're just like your father. You always get so emotional. Slowly the world handed you mirrors, and in them you saw a version of yourself reflected back, not as you are, but as others perceive you. And because you needed belonging, you accepted those reflections. You tried to live up to them or resist them. Either way, you were still shaped by them. The self you think you are is not the result of conscious design. It's the result of adaptation, a response to approval, rejection, expectation, culture, fear. It was never chosen, it was inherited. And then there's memory. Fragile, biased, incomplete. You tell yourself this is who I've always been, but memory is not a faithful record. It's a story you've retold so many times it feels like truth. You forget the parts that contradict the narrative. You exaggerate the parts that confirm it. If you believe you're not good at relationships, you remember the heartbreaks, not the healing. If you think you're lazy, you highlight the days you gave up and forget the days you carried weight no one saw. Your identity becomes a story curated by emotional resonance, not accuracy. Your mind also confuses consistency with truth. Just because a thought repeats doesn't make it valid. Just because you've believed something for a long time doesn't make it real. I'm not creative, you say. I don't deserve love. I'm not meant for more. These thoughts feel familiar, which makes them feel correct. But often they're just echoes of what someone once said to you, or what you once told yourself in a moment of pain. And the more they repeat, the deeper they etch into your self-picture. Not because they're accurate, but because they've gone unchallenged. Even your emotions contribute to the illusion. If you've felt anxious for years, you start identifying with anxiety. You say, I am an anxious person, instead of, I experience anxiety. You merge the state with the self. You forget that emotion is a passing wave, not a permanent identity. And once you identify with an emotion, you unconsciously cling to it. Because letting it go would mean not just feeling differently, but being someone different, and that's terrifying. Even when the old identity causes pain, familiar suffering often feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. And here's the deeper truth. The self you think you are is rooted in control. You've built it to be predictable, acceptable, understandable. To others, but also to yourself. Because unpredictability is scary, freedom is scary. To be untethered from identity is to float in the unknown. And so, instead of embracing the vastness of who you could be, you shrink into a mask. You limit your behavior to match the label. You say, I'm not that kind of person. Not because it's true, but because it would threaten the stability of your self-immediate to explore something new. But if you pause, if you step back, you'll notice something extraordinary. You are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not your stories, your labels, your past, your preferences, your reputation. You are the awareness behind them. You are the field in which those things arise and dissolve. You're not the storm, you're the sky it moves through. And in that space beyond the illusion of identity, you are free. Not free to become someone new, free to remember that you were never limited to begin with. You are not fixed. You are not finished. You are a process, a movement, a becoming. Every breath is a new beginning. Every insight is a doorway. You can drop an old belief mid-sentence and walk into a new way of being. You can release a lifelong fear and reclaim a part of yourself that's been waiting in silence. You are not bound by your past. You are not trapped by your name. You are not who they told you to be. You never were. This doesn't mean the self is an illusion to be rejected. It means the self is a tool, one you can shape, reshape, release, and recreate. It means that who you are is a flexible interface between your inner truth and the outer world. And when you stop clinging to one fixed version of it, you gain access to deeper intelligence, deeper creativity, deeper love, because you stop acting from fear of contradiction and start living from curiosity. You say, who am I now? And you let the answer surprise you. So many of your limits are illusions of identity. I'm not the kind of person who meditates. I'm not creative. I'm always like this in relationships. These are not truths. They are familiarities. Echoes of old patterns that feel real only because you've rehearsed them. But what if you didn't need to be the kind of person at all? What if you could just try, just act, just move without explanation? That's where transformation begins, not in becoming someone better, but in releasing the story of who you think you are. You're not broken, you're bound. Bound by ideas that were never fully yours. And as those ideas dissolve, what remains is not emptiness. It's spaciousness, it's possibility. You don't have to define yourself in order to be yourself. You just have to be with honesty, with presence, with a willingness to meet the moment fresh. That's what identity is meant to serve, not as a cage, but as a channel, and when it stops serving, you let it go. You are more than any role you've ever played, more than any name you've answered to, more than any script you've memorized. You are not who you think you are who you are. And that, in its rawest, most unconditioned form, is not a concept. It's a presence. It's alive. It's infinite. And it's waiting for you to remember. You don't experience people as they are. You experience them through the filter of who you believe they are. And, more dangerously, who you expect them to be. Every interaction is colored by assumption, past wounds, subconscious projections, and unconscious patterns that quietly dictate how you relate to others. You think you're seeing them clearly, understanding their intentions, reacting to what's actually happening, but more often than not, you're responding to a mental model you've constructed, not to the living, breathing reality of the person in front of you. This is the hidden architecture of illusion in relationships, and its cost is not just miscommunication, it's disconnection. From the beginning, you build stories about people. Sometimes they're based on fragments, one expression, one phrase, one mistake. You fill in the blanks with your own fears, your own history. You say, they don't care, when really they might just not know how to show it. You say, they're pulling away, when maybe they're struggling inside a silence they don't know how to voice. But instead of asking, you assume. Instead of observing, you narrate. And once that internal story hardens, it doesn't just shape how you interpret the other person, it shapes how you show up with them. And that creates a feedback loop. You expect withdrawal, so you withdraw. You expect criticism, so you grow defensive. You expect betrayal, so you guard yourself until the very thing you feared becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The illusion deepens when your ego gets involved. When someone doesn't validate you the way you expected, you take it personally. When they react from their own wounds, you assume it's about you. You interpret every action or lack of one through the lens of your worth. You think, if they really cared, they would. Or, if I mattered, they'd. And without realizing it, you start treating their behavior as a reflection of your value instead of recognizing that most people are acting from their own patterns, fears, and limitations. They're not rejecting you, they're reenacting their programming. And you're not being judged. You're just caught in the crossfire of their unhealed story colliding with yours. These illusions aren't malicious, they're protective. They come from a deep desire to understand, to feel safe, to make sense of complexity. It feels easier to label someone than to stay in the discomfort of not knowing. Easier to say they're selfish than to ask, what pain are they hiding? But when you do that, you reduce a human being to a pattern, and in doing so you lose the chance to truly connect. You stop seeing their nuance, you miss the humanity behind the reaction, and in trying to protect yourself from being hurt, you end up building a wall between you and the very intimacy you crave. Even in moments of love, illusion plays a role. You fall in love with potential, with projection, with the version of them that mirrors your unmet needs. You think they complete me, when what they really do is reflect back a part of yourself you long to reclaim. And that's not wrong, but it's incomplete, because once the projection fades and the real person begins to emerge, you may feel betrayed, not because they changed, but because the illusion couldn't be sustained. The closer you get to someone, the more your illusions start to crack. And that's when the real relationship begins, not when everything feels perfect, but when both of you are willing to stay and see each other beyond the masks. But it's not just how you misperceive others, it's also how you misperceive yourself. You carry illusions about who you are in relationships. I'm always the giver, I'm the one who cares more, I'm the emotionally mature one. And sometimes those labels feel noble, but they also trap you. Because when you believe you always play a certain role, you stop seeing your blind spots. You don't notice the ways you manipulate through caretaking, or the ways you avoid intimacy by staying in control, or the ways you use emotional language to justify subtle avoidance. The illusion isn't just in how you see others. It's in how you avoid seeing your own reflection clearly. This is why relationships become mirrors, not because the other person is your opposite, but because they reveal the parts of you you're not yet willing to confront. Your impatience, your neediness, your silence, your judgment, and also your softness, your brilliance, your longing to be held as you are. Every relationship, whether romantic or platonic, is an invitation to see more clearly, not just the other, but yourself. But clarity only comes when you release the illusion that you already understand. It only comes when you choose curiosity over certainty. So what happens when you begin to see through the illusion? First, the story starts to soften. You stop assuming. You start asking. You catch yourself when you leap to conclusions. You say, what else might be true here? You notice the moments when your reaction is larger than the situation, and you trace it back to an old wound, not to the person standing in front of you. You begin to separate what's real from what's remembered, and that creates space. Space for compassion, space for repair, space for connection that isn't built on projection, but on presence. You also become more gentle with yourself. You stop needing to be perfect. You stop needing to prove you're right. You realize that being misunderstood doesn't mean you're unworthy, and that sometimes misunderstanding others doesn't mean you've failed. It just means you're human. That's all any of us are. flawed, scared, hopeful humans trying to love and be loved, while wrestling with the illusions we don't yet know we carry. When you hold that truth, you begin to offer grace to yourself, to them, to the space between you. And maybe that's the secret. Not to rid yourself of illusion entirely, but to become aware of it, to recognize that everyone you meet is carrying a story just like you, a history, a mask, a longing. And when you look beneath the story, when you truly see, they soften, you soften, and something real begins to emerge. Not a perfect connection, but a human one, built not on illusion, but on the courage to keep looking deeper. You wake up and reach for your phone before your eyes even fully open. You scroll through emails, notifications, maybe social media, letting the tone of the outside world dictate your inner state before you've even taken a conscious breath. You go through your morning routine not with presence but with momentum. Habits layered upon habits, carried out not because you choose them but because they're familiar. You move through your day in a kind of waking trance, reacting to stimuli, to expectations, to pressures, to thoughts that seem to think themselves. This is autopilot. Not just a mental state, but a way of living. It's subtle, persistent, and deeply unconscious. And unless you interrupt it, it will quietly rob you of your life without you even noticing. Autopilot isn't just about routine. It's about disconnection from your senses, from your feelings, from your choices. It's the state in which your body acts while your awareness drifts elsewhere, into memory, into worry, into imagined futures that never arrive. And while you go through the motions, something essential is missing. You, your attention, your full presence. You begin responding to life based on patterns, not possibilities. You say things you didn't mean to say. You react with irritation when softness was called for. You make decisions out of fear, out of haste, out of programming. Then you look back, wondering why life feels mechanical, empty, out of sync. The truth is, most suffering doesn't come from what happens. It comes from how unconsciously you meet it. Awareness changes everything, and it starts in the smallest of moments. The moment you notice your hand reaching for your phone and ask, "What am I really seeking right now?" The moment you catch your breath shortening and ask, "What tension am I holding that I haven't named?" The moment you feel a rising urge to snap at someone and ask, "What part of me feels unseen or overwhelmed?" These aren't just mindfulness techniques, they're acts of reclamation. In that tiny pause, you exit the autopilot loop and enter the present. You don't just react, you see, and what you see, you can change. Moving from autopilot to awareness doesn't mean you stop having reactions. It means you stop being defined by them. You begin to observe your own patterns without fusing to them. You see the angry thought rise, and instead of speaking it, you hold it, breathe, and ask what it needs. You notice the habit to escape into distraction, and instead you stay. You feel the fear, and instead of letting it control your behavior, you let it pass like a wave, knowing it's not the whole ocean. Awareness creates space, and in that space a deeper intelligence emerges. One that doesn't need to defend, prove, or control, it just sees. And seeing clearly is the foundation of freedom. This transition isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming present. You begin to live with intention, not compulsion, with responsiveness, not reactivity. And from this place your choices become rooted not in fear or urgency, but in alignment. You act because something in you is ready. You speak because something in you is true. You move not to escape discomfort, but to meet the moment with all of yourself. And when life throws chaos your way, as it always will, you don't default to panic. You breathe, you return, you remember. Every moment of awareness is a return, a homecoming. It doesn't matter how many times you drift. What matters is that you keep waking up, again and again, because each time you return to presence, you reclaim your life from the fog of automatic living. You begin to touch reality as it is, not as your stories tell you it should be. You start to notice beauty where you used to see routine. You find choice where you used to feel stuck. You discover that underneath the noise, there's a clarity that's always been waiting for your attention, your trust, your presence. This is how change really begins, not by striving but by seeing, not by trying to be someone else but by being fully here. When you stop reacting and start seeing, life stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something you participate in, consciously, courageously, and awake. Everything you've ever believed about yourself, about others, about what's possible, has been filtered through illusions you didn't know you were wearing. But now, something in you has started to awaken. You've seen the distortions, the unconscious patterns, the quiet manipulations that have shaped your reality without your consent, and now you stand at the edge of something powerful, the choice to reclaim your mind, to stop living on autopilot, to stop being defined by fear, by inherited beliefs, by invisible programming. Liberation doesn't begin with changing the world, it begins by changing how you see it.